A $4 million Bugatti had been dead for 23 days. More than 200 specialists from 6 continents had failed to fix it. A $100 million investor event was counting down by the hour. And the woman who built an entire empire around that car was standing on the edge of losing everything she had ever worked for. Then a man walked in. No doctorate, no title, no reputation anyone in that room had ever heard of. Just a pair of calloused hands and a worn notebook that had belonged to his dead father. What happened next is something nobody in that garage saw coming. If you're watching this right now, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now stay with me until the end, because this one is worth it. The morning Ethan Cole got the call, he was lying flat on his back underneath a 2019 Ford F2 5.0 with a busted transmission, listening to country music playing too loud from a Bluetooth speaker someone had left on the workbench. The garage smelled the way it always did. Oil and metal shavings, and the faint chemical sweetness of brake cleaner. It was the smell of his entire adult life, and most days he didn't even notice it anymore. His phone buzzed against the concrete floor where he'd set it beside his socket wrench. He ignored it. Then it buzzed again, and again. He pulled himself out from under the truck on the creeper dolly, wiping his hands on a shop rag that was already past saving, and looked at the screen. 3 missed calls from a number he didn't recognize. Area code 310, Los Angeles. He almost didn't call back. He had a full day ahead of him. The F250, a Jeep Wrangler with a cracked differential, and a Honda Accord that had been misfiring for 2 weeks and whose owner kept calling every single morning like Ethan had been personally holding it hostage. He didn't have time for mystery calls from LA, but something made him dial. The voice on the other end was clipped, professional, with the particular kind of tension that money creates in people, that tight, controlled sound of someone who is used to problems being solved immediately and is currently experiencing one that isn't. "Is this Ethan Cole, the mechanic in Millhaven?" "Depends on who's asking," he said. "My name is Daniel Hess. I'm the Chief Operations Officer for Sterling Automotive Group. We have a situation, Mr. Cole, and we've been given your name by someone who believes you might be able to help us." Ethan sat down on a metal stool near the workbench. Through the open bay door, he could see the sky over Millhaven, gray and low, the kind of April sky that couldn't decide whether it wanted to rain or just threatened to all day. What kind of situation? There was a pause on the other end, the kind of pause that meant the person was deciding how much to say and how to say it without sounding desperate, even though they clearly were. "We have a vehicle that hasn't started in 23 days, a Bugatti Chiron Supersport. Our engineering team has been working on it around the clock since the problem began. We've brought in outside consultants, specialists from Europe, from Japan, from 3 different universities. Nobody has been able to identify the cause." Ethan was quiet for a second. "You said a Bugatti." "Yes. And you've had 200 specialists on it. 212 as of yesterday morning. And none of them figured it out." "No." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Mr. Hess, I'm a mechanic in a town of 11,000 people. I fix trucks and minivans and the occasional classic car somebody dragged out of a barn. I don't really see how I'm the solution to a problem that 212 specialists couldn't crack." "The person who referred you said something very specific," Hess said. "They said you think differently, that you look at problems differently. We're not asking you to be better than those 200 specialists, Mr. Cole. We're asking you to be different. At this point, different is all we have left." Ethan looked at his hands, at the grease that had worked its way into the creases of his knuckles in a way that never fully washed out anymore. "Who referred me?" "A man named Marcus Webb. He said you rebuilt his 1967 Shelby GT 500 3 years ago. Said you found a problem in 40 minutes that 3 other shops had spent 6 months missing." Marcus Webb. Ethan remembered him. Retired aerospace engineer, obsessive about that Mustang, drove up from Charlotte just to have Ethan look at it. Nice man, tipped well. "There's a timeline issue," Hess continued, and the tension in his voice ratcheted up just slightly. "We have a major investor presentation at 6 o'clock this evening. Ms. Sterling, our CEO, intends to demonstrate the vehicle at that event. If the car doesn't start, the entire event collapses, and the implications of that go well beyond one evening." What time is it now? 8:47. So roughly 10 hours. To solve a problem that 212 engineers hadn't cracked in 23 days. Ethan laughed. It wasn't a disrespectful laugh. It was the laugh of a man who genuinely couldn't tell if this was real or if somebody was pulling his leg. "You're serious," he said, when Hess didn't join in. "Mr. Cole, I have never been more serious about anything in my professional life." He told his assistant, 17-year-old Jake, who was technically still an intern but had started showing up every day regardless of whether he was scheduled, that he needed to handle the afternoon on his own. Jake stared at him like he'd just announced he was joining the circus. "The F250 needs the transmission. Tell Mr. Patterson it'll be ready Thursday. Tell Mrs. Kim the Accord is still being diagnosed. Don't touch the Jeep, you're not ready for differentials yet." "Where are you going?" Ethan was already pulling off his work shirt, reaching for the cleaner one hanging on a hook by the office door. "Los Angeles, Jake blinked. "Today?" "They're sending a car." He paused, then looked back at Jake with the expression of a man who still couldn't quite believe what he was saying. "A Bugatti company, Jake. They want me to look at a Bugatti." Jake's mouth opened, then closed, then, "You don't even like Bugattis." "Nobody asked me what I like." He almost called it off twice on the drive to the regional airport. Once, when he remembered he'd forgotten to arrange after-school pickup for his daughter Lily, and once when the sheer absurdity of the situation hit him fresh. He fixed the pickup situation with a call to his neighbor Sandra, who had been graciously covering Lily emergencies for 3 years, and who responded to his explanation with the calm efficiency of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by Ethan's life. 6 o'clock, Sandra said. "I honestly don't know when I'll be back." "She can stay for dinner. I'm making lasagna." "You're a saint, Sandra." "I know. You can tell me that again when you get home." The private charter that Sterling Automotive had sent was a small Cessna Citation that seated 8 and currently contained only Ethan and a man named Philip, who was apparently some kind of senior liaison, and who spent the entire flight trying to brief Ethan on the situation while Ethan read through the thick folder of documentation they'd sent ahead. 212 specialists, 23 days, 17 separate diagnostic approaches, 41 component replacements. None of it had worked. Ethan read slowly. He wasn't the kind of reader who skimmed. His father had taught him that the single most expensive thing a mechanic could do was read a report fast. You skimmed a report, you missed the thing buried on page 6 that was the whole story. He read every page. Philip kept talking. Ethan kept reading. Outside the small oval window, the landscape below shifted from green to brown to the sprawling gray grid of Southern California. The Sterling Automotive facility in Hawthorne was not what Ethan had expected, though he wasn't entirely sure what he'd expected. It was enormous. A low, sleek complex of connected buildings that looked more like an architecture firm's vision of the future than a working garage. The exterior was all glass and brushed concrete, with the company's logo, a stylized silver comet, embedded in the entrance courtyard. Inside the main garage where the Bugatti sat was the size of an airplane hangar. The car itself was in the center, surrounded by a loose ring of equipment, diagnostic terminals, laptop stations, mobile sensor arrays, 2 separate engine analysis rigs that had clearly been brought in from outside. Cables ran everywhere. The lighting was intense and clinical. The car was extraordinary, even like this, even dead. The Bugatti Chiron Supersport in French racing blue, sitting low and still and gorgeous under those harsh lights like something between a sculpture and a weapon. Ethan had worked on a lot of cars in his life. He'd never worked on anything that looked like this. There were about 40 people in the room when he walked in. Some were at laptop stations. Some were standing in clusters, talking quietly. A few looked up when he entered, their expressions ranging from politely curious to openly skeptical. He was wearing clean jeans, work boots, and a button-down shirt, the most formal outfit he owned that wasn't a wedding suit. And he was carrying a canvas bag with his father's notebook and a few personal tools he never went anywhere without. He felt the looks land on him. He was used to that feeling. It had happened his whole life. In high school, when the guidance counselor had strongly suggested trade school with the particular brand of low expectation that some people dress up as practical advice. In his 20s, when he'd show up to car shows with vehicles, he'd rebuilt himself and people would check the placard twice because they didn't think the work matched the person standing next to it. He didn't let it bother him, or rather, he'd gotten very good at not letting it show. A tall man in a charcoal suit crossed the room toward him. Late 50s, silver hair, the kind of posture that comes from decades of making rooms listen to him. He extended his hand. "Daniel Hess, we spoke on the phone. Thank you for coming, Mr. Cole." "Ethan," he said. "Mr. Cole is my father." Something shifted almost imperceptibly in Hess's face. "Of course. Can I introduce you to it?" "Before introductions," Ethan said, keeping his voice even and polite, "can I ask a question?" Hess gestured for him to continue. "Those reports I read on the plane, were all of them included? Every diagnostic run? Every component check? Every replacement log?" "Everything we have, 640 pages. "Okay." Ethan looked at the car. "And who was the last team to work on it, before I got here?" "A group from Stuttgart, Bugatti's own engineering team. They left 4 days ago." "What did they say when they left?" Hess paused for half a beat. "They said the vehicle appeared to be in perfect mechanical condition, but it won't start." "Correct." Ethan nodded slowly. He set his canvas bag down on a clear section of a nearby workbench, opened it, and pulled out a yellow legal pad and a pen. Then he looked at the ring of technicians and engineers still watching him from various points around the room. "Who's been on this the longest?" he asked, raising his voice slightly. "Who's been here since day one?" A man near the far side raised his hand. Mid-40s, dark circles under his eyes, the look of someone who had been sleeping in 4-hour chunks for 3 weeks. "That'd be me. Greg Tanner, head of diagnostics." "Greg, walk me through what you found on day 1. Not the report. Just talk to me. What did you see? What did you do? What did you think?" Tanner glanced briefly at Hess, who gave a small nod. "We turned the key. Nothing happened. No crank, no starter engagement, nothing. All dashboard systems were showing normal. Battery was good. We confirmed that first. ECU was receiving power. We ran a full OBD scan. No fault codes. That's when things got weird." "No fault codes," Ethan repeated. He was writing on the legal pad. "0. The car's computer showed no errors. Everything it could see looked fine." "Okay. What did you check next?" This went on for 40 minutes. Ethan stood at the workbench with his legal pad and asked Greg Tanner questions, and occasionally questions to the other technicians who'd been on the project at various points, while he mapped the sequence of everything that had been attempted. He drew boxes and arrows and circled things and crossed other things out. It wasn't elegant. The legal pad looked like the notes of someone working through a problem out loud on paper, which is exactly what it was. Nobody interrupted him, which surprised him a little. He'd half expected someone to step in and tell him this had all been covered already. But Hess had apparently given word that Ethan was to be allowed to work unimpeded, and so the room waited with the particular collective tension of people who have run out of their own ideas and are watching someone else try theirs. At some point during this, a door opened at the far end of the garage, and the room changed. It was subtle, a slight straightening of postures, a turning of heads, a drop in the ambient conversation level. Ethan noticed it from the corner of his eye, but kept writing. He was in the middle of something. "Mr. Cole." The voice was calm and direct and not particularly loud, but it had the quality of a voice that was accustomed to being heard regardless of volume. He finished writing the sentence he was on, then looked up. Aurora Sterling was 30 years old, but she carried herself with the particular authority of someone who had been forced to grow up fast and had done so without apology. She was dressed in a dark blazer over a white shirt, her dark hair pulled back in a practical knot, and her expression was the kind that gave nothing away while suggesting it knew quite a lot. She had the look of someone who had not slept more than 5 hours in recent memory, and who was refusing to let that be visible. Ethan had read about her on the plane in the company materials Philip had provided. She'd inherited Sterling Automotive at 24 after her father's sudden death, when the company was already in decline. In 6 years, she had rebuilt it entirely, retooled the engineering division, repositioned the brand, grown revenue by 400%. She was by any reasonable measure one of the most impressive automotive executives in the world. She also looked, at this particular moment, like a person holding something together by sheer force of will alone. "Miss Sterling," he said. She crossed to where he was standing and looked briefly at the legal pad. "Daniel tells me you've been going through the diagnostic history." "Yes." "What do you think so far?" "I don't think anything yet. I'm still trying to understand what's been done." She looked at him steadily. "We have about 9 hours." "I know. I need to know whether you think this is solvable." He looked at her, then at the car, then back at her. "Every problem is solvable. The question is whether we have time to find this one." A silence. She studied him for a moment, not hostile, but evaluating. The look of someone deciding whether the confidence she was hearing was real or performed. "What do you need?" she finally asked. "I need everyone to stop talking to me for about an hour," he said. "I need to go through the reports again now that I've talked to your team, and then I need to physically look at the car." She held his gaze for another 2 seconds. Then, "You'll have whatever you ask for." She turned and walked back toward the door she'd come through, stopping to say something low and brief to Hess on the way. The room gradually resumed its previous state. Ethan went back to his legal pad. Bomb. His father, Raymond Cole, had been a mechanic for 38 years in a small shop in Roanoke, Virginia. He'd never gone to college. He'd never had his name on anything that wasn't a business card. But he had developed, over the course of those 3 decades, a philosophy of diagnosis that he'd written down in a series of notebooks. Cramped, careful handwriting that covered everything from basic engine theory to what Raymond called the behavior of systems under conflict. The core idea was simple enough to state and genuinely difficult to execute. Most mechanics, when confronted with a problem they couldn't immediately identify, started looking for the broken part, the thing that had failed. Raymond believed this was usually the wrong approach, because in complex systems, the thing that appeared broken was often not the thing that was causing the problem. It was just the thing that was reacting to it. Raymond's approach was to map the relationships between systems first, to ask not what is wrong with this component, but what is this component's behavior telling me about its relationship with the things connected to it? He believed that most mysterious problems, the ones that confounded people, the ones where everything looked fine, were caused by conflicts between systems that were individually functioning correctly. 2 healthy systems interacting in a way that created a failure neither would produce on its own. He'd written it down as a guiding principle on the first page of the first notebook in his careful handwriting. A system in conflict with another system may appear normal in isolation. The malfunction lives in the relationship, not the component. Ethan had read those notebooks so many times growing up that certain passages had lodged in his memory the way song lyrics do, effortlessly, permanently. He'd internalized the philosophy so thoroughly that he often didn't consciously realize he was applying it. It just shaped the way he looked at things. Right now, looking at his legal pad and going back through the reports with what the diagnostics team had told him layered on top, something was nagging at him. He kept coming back to the same 2 entries in the diagnostic log, separated by 4 days and written by 2 completely different teams who had apparently never cross-referenced their findings. The first was from day 3. A note from the European consulting team that the Bugatti's high-voltage module, which managed power distribution across the vehicle's complex electrical architecture, had shown a reading of 0.3 millivolts above its baseline threshold during one specific test. The note described this as within acceptable parameters and moved on. They had checked the HVM in isolation. It looked fine. The second was from day 11. A note from the university team out of MIT that the vehicle's immobilizer authentication system, the security system that communicated with the key to authorize ignition, had completed its authentication cycle 0.08 seconds slower than manufacturer spec during a series of tests. Also described as within acceptable parameters. Also checked in isolation. Also apparently fine. 2 small anomalies. Both dismissed individually. Never mentioned in the same paragraph by any of the 212 specialists who'd passed through. Ethan circled both entries on his legal pad and drew a line connecting them. He sat there for a moment, staring at the connection. Then he opened his father's notebook to a page near the back, one he'd read so many times the paper had gone soft along the crease. Raymond had written in reference to an old Cadillac with an electrical problem that had stumped 4 shops. When two systems are both slightly off in ways that, individually, each falls within spec, ask what they share. Find the conversation they're having that nobody else is listening to. Ethan looked up at the Bugatti. The HVM managed power distribution. The IAS required a precise power signal at a precise moment to complete its authentication cycle. If the HVM was introducing even a marginal fluctuation in that signal at exactly the wrong instant, the IAS might be receiving just enough power to appear to complete authentication, but not enough to send the final authorization to the starter system. Both systems would look fine in isolation because neither was broken. The problem was the conversation between them. He stood up and picked up his canvas bag. "Greg," he called across the garage. Tanner looked over from where he was at a laptop. "Did anyone ever run the HVM and the IAS simultaneously during the same test sequence? Both systems active at the same time, logging output in real time?" Greg Tanner opened his mouth, then closed it. He turned back to his laptop and started typing. He scrolled through something for about 30 seconds. "No," he said, and there was a new quality in his voice. Something that wasn't quite hope, but was adjacent to it. "Everyone ran them separately. Separate tests, separate logs." "That's what I thought." Ethan pulled on a pair of nitrile gloves. "I need a dual-channel oscilloscope, and I need to run the HVM monitoring lead and the IAS output lead simultaneously. Can you set that up?" Tanner was already reaching for his radio. The next 2 hours were methodical and quiet, which surprised some of the people watching. There was a general expectation, Ethan sensed, that he would do something dramatic, produce some flash of insight, make a bold move, say something revelatory. What he actually did was set up equipment carefully, run the dual-channel test slowly, and watch numbers on a screen with the focused patience of someone who had learned from a man who never once rushed a diagnosis in his life. The room had gradually filled up. Word had apparently spread that something was happening, and people who'd been working elsewhere in the facility had drifted in. Ethan was aware of the crowd accumulating behind him, but didn't let it change his pace. The first dual-channel run showed him almost exactly what he'd hypothesized, but not quite. The HVM was producing a voltage fluctuation, barely measurable, 0.31 millivolts above baseline, but it was intermittent. It didn't happen every cycle. He ran the sequence again, watching for the timing. "There," he said quietly, mostly to himself. The fluctuation occurred 0.04 seconds before the IAS sent its authentication completion signal. A tiny window. But in that tiny window, the IAS, which required a stable voltage signal to send a clean authorization, was receiving a slightly unstable one. The authentication completed in the IAS's own internal log. The car's computer showed it as complete, but the authorization signal that actually needed to reach the starter control module was carrying just enough degradation that the starter module was rejecting it. Not because anything was broken, because two systems were having an argument at precisely the wrong moment, in a language too quiet for any single system diagnostic to hear. He straightened up and turned around. 40-some people were watching him. He saw Greg Tanner, who looked like a man who was being handed back something he thought he'd lost. He saw Hess, stone-faced but attentive. He saw Aurora Sterling standing near the back wall, arms crossed, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "The high-voltage module is producing a periodic micro-fluctuation," Ethan said, keeping his voice matter-of-fact. "It's within spec when measured alone, which is why nobody flagged it. The immobilizer authentication system is operating within spec when measured alone, for the same reason. But they share a power delivery pathway, and the HVM's fluctuation is occurring in a window that overlaps with the IAS's authorization signal. The starter module is receiving a corrupted authorization. It's not getting fired because it keeps seeing a signal it can't trust." Silence. Then Tanner, "How do you fix it?" "Two adjustments. They have to be done in sequence. If you do the second one first, you'll push the problem somewhere else without solving it. He picked up a specialized trim tool from his bag. First, we recalibrate the HVM's voltage regulation threshold by 0.5 millivolt. This requires accessing the HVM's adjustment port behind the driver's side secondary panel. Second, after that calibration is confirmed stable, we reset the IAS's authentication timing buffer. That clears the residual signal degradation from 23 days of attempted starts. Another silence, longer this time. "You're saying the car isn't broken," someone said from the back. Ethan didn't see who. "It's just confused," he said. "The systems are fighting each other. We stop the fight. They both do their jobs." He turned back to the car. "Ye?" He worked quietly. Greg Tanner stayed close, handing him tools when he asked for them, watching everything with the intensity of someone who intended to understand every step. A few other technicians edged closer as he worked. Nobody spoke much. The room had the quality of held breath. The HVM access panel came off cleanly. The adjustment port was exactly where the schematics said it would be. Ethan had studied those on the plane too, in the technical documentation Philip had loaded into a tablet for him. He made the calibration adjustment with a trim tool and a voltage meter, working slowly and checking twice before locking the setting. "Give me a readout," he said. Tanner read the voltage off the monitoring screen. 0.1 above baseline, holding. "Good. Wait." He watched the screen for another full minute, counting cycles. "It's stable. Now we do the IAS buffer reset." The IAS reset was accessed through the diagnostic port with a specific command sequence. He'd written it out on his legal pad from the technical specs, because he hadn't trusted himself to remember it exactly. He wasn't the kind of person who was too proud to write things down. His father had always said that the smartest mechanics were the ones who wrote everything down, because it meant they were spending their brain on thinking instead of memorizing. He entered the command sequence. The IAS system light on the dashboard display blinked twice, then held steady. "Okay," Ethan said. He stepped back. He pulled off his right glove and picked up the key fob from where it had been sitting in a labeled evidence bag on the nearby workbench. He looked at it for a moment. The room was completely silent. He pressed the unlock button, reached into the car, and pressed the start button. The Bugatti W16 engine turned over once, twice, and then erupted. Not a cough, not a hesitant catch. It came alive, the way a thing does when it's been waiting a long time. The deep, extraordinary sound of 16 cylinders firing in sequence, filling the entire hangar and bouncing off the glass walls and going through the floor and into the chest of every single person standing there. It ran smooth and strong and absolutely correct. Ethan stood with his hand still on the door frame and listened to it for a moment. He was aware distantly of the sounds the people behind him were making. The exhale of 40 held breaths, someone saying something in a language he didn't recognize. What might have been a single involuntary laugh from Greg Tanner. He was thinking for just a second about his father, about a garage in Roanoke and a man who'd never gotten credit for any of this but whose thinking was running in every room this car's engine had ever failed to start in. Then he stepped back and turned around. The room was in a state he didn't have quite the right word for. Not celebration, it was too stunned for that. Not silence. There was noise, there was motion, there were people grabbing each other's arms and pointing at the display screens. It was that particular human moment that happens when something that seemed impossible turns out not to be, and everyone in the room is simultaneously adjusting their understanding of what's possible. Greg Tanner was standing 10 feet away, staring at him with an expression that was somewhere between professional respect and genuine bewilderment. "How long have you been thinking about this?" Tanner asked. "The sensor conflict idea. When did you get there?" Ethan looked at his legal pad with its circles and arrows and connections. "Somewhere over Arizona." Tanner let out a long, slow breath. 23 days, he said. "We were on this thing for 23 days. "You were looking for what was broken," Ethan said. He didn't say it as an insult. There was no edge in it. "Nothing was broken. That's why you couldn't find it." Behind him, the Bugatti continued to run, filling the room with its extraordinary voice. 23 days of silence, finally, completely over. And from across the garage, Aurora Sterling was already walking toward him, and on her face was an expression that Ethan Cole, for all his ability to read complicated systems, wasn't yet sure he knew how to interpret. Aurora Sterling crossed that garage floor the way she moved through most things, with the particular forward momentum of someone who had learned early that hesitation was expensive. But she stopped about 2 feet short of where Ethan was standing, and for just a moment, she didn't say anything at all. The Bugatti was still running behind him. The sound of it filled the space between them. "How?" she said finally. Not a full question, just the word. Ethan pulled off his remaining glove and tucked both of them into his back pocket. "I told you, the 2 sensor systems were—" I heard the technical explanation. She shook her head just slightly. "I mean, how did you see it when nobody else did? 212 people, Mr. Cole. Engineers from Bugatti's own factory. People with degrees from places I couldn't get into. And you walked in here with a legal pad and found it in—" She glanced at the clock on the far wall. 3 hours and 40 minutes. He looked at the legal pad still in his hand. There was something uncomfortable about this moment, and he recognized the discomfort as the particular kind that comes when you're being credited for something that doesn't feel entirely yours. What he'd done today, the way he'd thought through it, the framework he'd used, none of that had originated with him. "My father taught me to look at how systems talk to each other," he said, "not at the systems themselves. The other teams were looking for something broken. There wasn't anything broken, so they kept coming up empty. I was looking for a conflict, which is different." Aurora studied him. She had the quality of someone who listened well, not the performed listening of executives who nod at appropriate intervals while thinking about something else, but actual attention, the kind that processes and weighs. "Your father was a mechanic. 38 years. Small shop in Roanoke. Is he—" "He passed 4 years ago." A brief pause. "I'm sorry." "Yeah." He folded the legal pad and tucked it under his arm. "Me too." Daniel Hess materialized at Aurora's shoulder, which seemed to be his primary professional function, and leaned slightly toward her. "We should start the pre-event prep. 6 hours." Aurora didn't look at him. She was still looking at Ethan. "Give me a minute, Daniel." Hess retreated. "The notebook," Aurora said. She'd noticed it, the worn composition notebook Ethan had pulled out at the workbench earlier and referenced twice during his diagnostic work. "Is that his?" "Yes." "What's in it?" "His whole system, the way he thought about diagnostics. He wrote it down over about 20 years, added to it whenever he figured something new out." Ethan looked down at the canvas bag where the notebook sat. "He didn't have formal training, couldn't explain things the way a professor would, but the logic in those pages, I've never seen anything like it." Aurora was quiet for a moment. Then, "Would you be willing to stay for the event tonight?" He'd been expecting to be thanked, handed an envelope, and sent back to the airport. The question caught him slightly off guard. "I've got a daughter in Millhaven." "How old?" 8. "We can have you back on the plane by 11. She's with someone safe tonight?" "My neighbor." Aurora's expression shifted. Not softer exactly, but something in it acknowledged the information in a way that felt real rather than diplomatic. "I'd like you there, and I'd like the chance to talk to you more. Not tonight. Tonight will be chaos. But after." Ethan looked at the car, which was still running, and then at the room full of people who were beginning to move again, beginning to rebuild the ordinary texture of a working day after the suspended shock of the last hour. Greg Tanner was at his laptop, typing rapidly, probably writing up the diagnostic findings with the particular energy of someone who needs to process something by documenting it. "Sure," Ethan said. "I can stay." What he didn't say, what he didn't know yet how to articulate, was that something about the last 4 hours had settled in him in a way he hadn't anticipated. He'd come here expecting to look at a car, solve or not solve a problem, and go home. He hadn't expected to feel the way he felt right now, which was something close to the feeling he got on the rare occasions when he explained his father's system to someone and watched their face change as they understood it. There was a particular satisfaction in that. He'd forgotten he was capable of it. He picked up his canvas bag. "Where do I wait?" Aurora turned to a young woman who had appeared at a respectful distance, holding a tablet. Maya, can you get Mr. Cole set up in the executive lounge? And make sure the kitchen knows he hasn't eaten since whenever. She looked back at Ethan. Have you eaten? Coffee on the plane. Right. She said it with the flat, slightly exasperated tone of someone who recognized the behavior because she shared it. Maya will take care of you. Then she turned and walked in 3 different directions more or less simultaneously, which was not physically possible. Ethan registered, but captured something accurate about how she moved through a room. The young woman named Maya appeared at his elbow. She was maybe 25, brisk and competent, with the look of someone who had mastered the professional skill of being slightly invisible. This way, Mr. Cole. Ethan, he said for the second time that day. Ethan, are you allergic to anything? No. Do you have a preference for... Anything hot is fine. And coffee. However much coffee you have. Maya smiled briefly. We have a lot of coffee. He followed her out of the garage, and the sound of the Bugatti's engine faded behind him like something signing off. He found a quiet corner of the executive lounge and called Sandra first. Lily had gotten home from school, eaten half a granola bar, and was currently attempting to teach Sandra's dog a trick that the dog was, according to Sandra, showing no interest in learning. He could hear Lily's voice in the background saying something about the correct treat size, with the particular authority of an 8-year-old who has decided she is an expert. He sat there with the phone to his ear for an extra few seconds after he'd gotten all the logistical information he needed, just listening to her. She's fine, Sandra said. Stop hovering by phone. I'm not hovering. Ethan, tell her I'll call before bed. I will. Go do whatever it is you're doing. He sat with the phone face down on the table after he hung up and ate whatever Maya had arranged, a sandwich and a bowl of soup that was genuinely good, which surprised him slightly because institutional food had conditioned him to expect otherwise. He drank 2 cups of coffee and stared at the Los Angeles afternoon through the floor-to-ceiling window and tried to organize his thoughts. He was still sitting there, with the notebook open in front of him to a page he'd been reviewing during the flight, when Greg Tanner knocked on the open door of the lounge. Sorry to interrupt. Ethan shook his head. Come in. Tanner came in and sat down across from him without being invited, which Ethan respected. People who asked permission to sit down in empty rooms always made him slightly nervous. I wanted to talk to you about what happened in there, Tanner said. The diagnosis. I've been running diagnostics on high-performance vehicles for 18 years and I missed it completely. I want to understand how. You didn't miss it because you're not good at your job, Ethan said. That's generous, but I mean it. You missed it because you were using the right tools in the wrong sequence. Every test you ran was correct. You just ran them separately. He tapped the notebook. My father called it single-system blindness. When a problem is complex enough, the specialists who are best at examining individual components can be the least likely to see a cross-system conflict because their expertise teaches them to isolate. Isolation is usually how you find problems. In this case, isolation was what was hiding it. Tanner leaned forward, elbows on the table. He had the look of someone who was reconfiguring something internally, fitting new information into a structure that was already large and detailed. The HVM fluctuation was on the log from day 3. I read that log. I approved moving past it. It was within spec. 0.3 millivolts over baseline. Right. And on its own, it was meaningless. It was only meaningful in the context of what the IAS needed at that specific moment. Ethan paused. How many tests did your teams run where the HVM and the IAS were both active at the same time? Tanner was quiet. None, Ethan said. Not harshly, just stating it, because there was no diagnostic protocol that required it. We had protocols for each system. There was no protocol for testing their interaction during ignition sequence. Because nobody wrote one. Because nobody had seen a failure mode that required it. They sat with that for a moment. It wasn't a comfortable silence, but it was an honest one. Can I look at the notebook? Tanner asked. Ethan turned it toward him. Tanner read for a minute, then 2. His expression was that of a man reading something that is simultaneously simpler and more rigorous than he expected. He developed this on his own? Over about 25 years, yeah. This principle here, Tanner pointed at the page, about conflict signatures. The idea that two systems in conflict will each display a characteristic that looks like noise rather than a fault. We have a term for it in advanced electronics. It's called coherent interference, but I've never seen anyone apply it to mechanical diagnostics this way. He didn't know the electronics term. He just watched enough cars long enough that he started seeing the pattern. Tanner sat back. He was quiet for another moment, and Ethan got the sense he was working towards something he wasn't sure how to say. Can I ask you something personal? Go ahead. Why are you still running a one-man shop in a town of 11,000 people? Ethan looked at him. It wasn't an insulting question. It was asked with genuine curiosity, the kind that was actually asking, "What are you doing here?" when you could clearly be somewhere else. He'd been asked versions of this question before, usually by people who meant it as a compliment and landed it somewhere in the vicinity of an insult. But Tanner seemed to be asking it cleanly without an agenda attached. My daughter, Ethan said simply. Her life is there. Her school, her friends, Sandra's dog that she's apparently trying to train. After her mother left, Millhaven was the stable thing. I didn't want to uproot that. Her mother, it's not a dramatic story. She left when Lily was 3. We're fine. Lily's fine. He said it in the tone of someone who had answered that question enough times to have the answer fully assembled. The shop is mine. I work the hours I want. I'm home when she gets off the bus. It fits. Tanner nodded. He seemed to understand that the subject was answered rather than closed. How old is she? 8. Going on 42. That got a genuine laugh out of Tanner, which changed his face considerably, made him look less like a man who'd been running on 3-hour sleep increments for 3 weeks, and more like a person. They talked for another half hour, mostly about the diagnostic approach, Tanner asking questions and Ethan answering them, the notebook open between them like a reference text. At some point, Maya reappeared with more coffee. At another point, 2 of the other technicians from the garage knocked and came in and joined the conversation, which gradually became less an interview and more an actual discussion. People asking each other things, building on what the previous person said, the kind of conversation that happens when everyone in the room is genuinely trying to figure something out. Ethan realized somewhere in the middle of this that he was enjoying himself. Not performing enjoyment, actually having it. The particular pleasure of being surrounded by people who care about the same things you care about, thinking out loud with them. Everyone's thinking getting sharper because of the friction. He hadn't had a conversation like this in a while. Millhaven was good for a lot of things. It wasn't always good for this. The investor event began at 6 in a separate facility adjacent to the main garage. A large, carefully staged presentation space where Sterling Automotive had apparently spent considerable money making everything look effortless. Ethan had been given a seat in the back, which suited him fine. He wasn't there to be seen. He was there because Aurora had asked him to be, and he was still trying to understand exactly why. He watched from his seat as the room filled, 50 or 60 people, a mix of financial types and automotive industry figures, the particular crowd that gathered around money and machinery. They had the collective energy of people who were here to be impressed, who had pre-decided to be impressed, but were also watching carefully to see if the thing deserved it. Aurora came out at 6:15, and what Ethan noticed, sitting in the back, watching, was the degree to which she'd rebuilt herself since the morning. In the garage earlier, she'd been contained, controlled, but unmistakably a person under pressure. Now she was something else. She stood at the front of that room with the kind of presence that isn't learned in presentation training, the kind that comes from actually believing in what you're saying. She talked about the company's engineering philosophy. She talked about what Sterling Automotive was building toward. She used language that was specific and grounded rather than visionary and vague, which immediately distinguished her from every other executive presentation Ethan had ever half listened to. She knew the technical details. She quoted tensile strength specifications and cited aerodynamic test data and talked about their proprietary carbon fiber layering process with the fluency of someone who had spent time on the shop floor understanding it. Then she said, 6 months ago, we encountered an engineering challenge that tested this company. I'm not going to tell you it was easy or that we solved it quickly or that nobody struggled. We struggled. We brought in the best people we could find and they gave us everything they had. And then something unexpected happened that reminded me of something I'd forgotten. She paused. The best solution to a complex problem doesn't always come from the most expensive source. Sometimes it comes from someone who was taught to think about problems in a way that most of us weren't. Today, a few hours before this event, we solved that challenge. And the person who solved it is sitting in this room. Ethan became aware that several heads had turned. He looked at his coffee cup. "I'm not going to embarrass him by asking him to stand up," Aurora continued, which was the single most considerate thing anyone had said to him all day. "But I wanted you all to know that what you're about to see, what you're about to hear, is possible because someone with a very particular kind of knowledge walked into our garage this morning. And it made me think differently about what knowledge looks like and where it lives, and how easy it is to miss it when it doesn't come with the credentials we're trained to expect." She let that sit for a moment. Then she nodded to someone off to the side, and the far wall of the presentation space, which turned out to be a large roll-up door, began to rise. Behind it, under a single overhead spotlight that someone had very deliberately positioned, was the Bugatti. Its engine was already running. The sound of it entered the room ahead of it, that deep W16 register that you felt before you properly heard it, and the intake breath of 60 people happening simultaneously was its own kind of sound. The car rolled forward slowly on the polished floor, guided by a Sterling technician, and came to rest at the center of the space. Ethan watched the room watch the car. He watched people's faces do the thing that faces do when they encounter something that exceeds their expectation. That involuntary recalibration, the jaw that relaxes slightly, the eyes that go slightly wider. A woman in the front row, who had the practiced neutrality of someone who evaluated luxury assets for a living, reached out and touched her husband's arm without appearing to notice she'd done it. He felt something sitting in his chest that he didn't immediately have a name for. Not pride exactly, more like the feeling of a weight being set down, something he'd been carrying without realizing how long he'd had it. He pulled out his phone under the table and texted Lily's number, which she'd been given a phone for specifically so he could reach her at Sandra's. "Everything good there?" The reply came in 40 seconds, which meant she'd been holding the phone. "Yes, Dad. Sandra let me have 2 pieces of lasagna. The dog learned the trick, by the way." He smiled at the screen in the dark back of the room. "Which trick? The one where you put the treat on his nose and he flips it." "I was right about the treat size." "Of course you were. Are you done with the car yet?" He looked up at the Bugatti, gleaming and running and absolutely alive under the spotlight, while 60 investors watched it with the particular kind of attention that means money is moving in their minds. "Yeah," he typed. "The car is good. Cool. Can I see it sometime?" He looked at it for another moment. He thought about his father, who had loved cars not for what they cost, but for what they were. Complex things built by people, full of systems trying to work together, occasionally getting in each other's way. He thought about how much Raymond Cole would have loved to see this particular car come back to life. "Maybe someday," he wrote back. He put his phone away. Across the room, Aurora Sterling was answering a question from someone in the front row, and she was answering slightly as she answered it. Not a performance smile, the other kind, the kind you don't always control. The Bugatti sat behind her, ticking quietly as its engine warmed, filling the room with the sound of something that had been voiceless for 23 days. The evening was moving forward, and Ethan Cole sat in the back of a room full of people who had no idea who he was. And he thought about his father's handwriting in a worn notebook, and about a conflict between 2 sensor systems, and about the particular way that some knowledge travels, not in lecture halls or conference rooms, but in the space between a father and a son, one careful lesson at a time, waiting years to become useful, waiting for exactly the right broken thing to find it. After the event wound down, the questions and the handshakes and the particular choreography of wealthy people deciding how interested they were willing to appear, Aurora found him. She'd changed at some point into something slightly less formal, the blazer gone, which somehow made her look more like herself. Or maybe it was just that the controlled tension of the morning had released enough that the actual person was more visible underneath it. "Come with me," she said. He followed her past the presentation space, back through the facility corridor, and into an office that was large enough to be impressive, but too lived in to feel curated. Books stacked sideways on shelves because they'd run out of upright space. A whiteboard with old writing that hadn't been erased. A coffee maker on a side table that had clearly seen daily use for years. A single framed photograph on the desk, turned slightly away from him. She sat down on one side of the desk. He sat across from her. The investors were pleased, she said. I could tell. 3 of them want to schedule follow-up meetings this week. One of them increased his position before he left the parking lot. She said it matter-of-factly, not boasting, just reporting. A month ago, I was looking at the real possibility that this company was going to enter a credibility crisis it couldn't survive. Tonight went differently. Good. She looked at him. You don't want credit for that. It's not my company. It wouldn't have happened without you. He shifted in the chair slightly. It happened because your team spent 23 days collecting data that I got to read for 4 hours. It happened because your team ran every test correctly, just not in the combination that mattered. I didn't do this instead of them. I did it with what they built. Aurora was quiet for a moment. Then she said something he didn't expect. You sound like you've had to argue for that before. He looked at her. Argue for what? For credit being shared. For the work mattering more than who gets seen doing it. It was accurate enough that it was slightly uncomfortable. My father believed in it. He wasn't great at being seen, he was great at solving things. Did that bother him? Sometimes. More than he'd admit. Ethan looked at his hands. He'd have done it the same way anyway. It wasn't really about the recognition for him, it was just, he knew the work was good. He wanted it to matter to someone. It mattered today. He didn't say anything for a moment. I want to offer you something, Aurora said, and I want to be upfront that it's going to sound like I'm offering you this because of what you did today. And that's partly true, but it's not the whole reason. I've been thinking, since about 2 hours after you walked in this morning, about a different problem. What problem? I have a world-class engineering team, technically exceptional people, and this morning demonstrated a gap in how they think about complex system failures that no amount of technical skill was filling. She leaned forward slightly. Your father's methodology, the systems conflict approach, that isn't a trick. That's a diagnostic philosophy. And I don't have anyone in this company who thinks that way. Ethan was quiet. I want to build it in, she said, not as a patch or a training session, as a fundamental change to how this company approaches complex diagnostics. And I want to know if you'd be willing to help me do that. The office was very quiet. Somewhere in the facility beyond, he could hear the distant sound of the garage still active, the ordinary sounds of people finishing up their day. What would that look like? He said. Initially, coming here, not permanently. I'm not asking you to relocate your daughter, but a regular engagement, consulting, working with Greg's team, helping me build a diagnostic protocol that incorporates what your father developed. She paused. I also want to start a training program. Young people, people who come from the same kind of background you do, who maybe don't have the credentials but have the mechanical intuition. I want your father's approach documented and taught. Ethan stared at her. That's not a small thing you're describing, he said. No, that's... He stopped. That would take time. Real time. Yes. I have a shop. I know. And a daughter. I know that too. He leaned back in the chair. The ceiling above Aurora's desk had a water stain in the corner that someone had painted over but not quite covered. The ghost of it still visible if you looked. He stared at it for a second. My father spent 38 years in a shop nobody ever heard of, he said, doing work that nobody except his customers ever knew existed. He was good at something genuinely rare, and he never got any farther with it than Roanoke, Virginia. He said it without bitterness, but not without weight. He was okay with that. He made his peace with it. But I used to watch him sometimes and think about what could have happened if someone had taken his ideas seriously, what those ideas could have become. Aurora didn't say anything. She understood, apparently, that she didn't need to. If I'm going to do this, Ethan said, I need certain things. Tell me. The training program is real. Not a PR initiative, not a brochure. Real apprenticeships, real mentorship, real pathways to actual positions in the company. Kids from backgrounds like mine who'd never get through the front door otherwise. Agreed. My shop stays open. I go back to Millhaven. I keep the business running. Whatever arrangement we work out has to accommodate that. Agreed. And my father's name goes on the methodology. He looked at her directly. If you document it and teach it and build it into this company, it goes out with his name attached. Raymond Cole's diagnostic philosophy, not mine. His. Aurora held his gaze for a long moment. Agreed, she said quietly. Outside, the Los Angeles evening had gone full dark while they'd been talking, the city's light replacing the skies in the way it does. Not a surrender of the day, but a different kind of brightness taking over. And in a garage not far from where they sat, a Bugatti that had been silent for 23 days was cooling down after its first real run, ticking softly to itself, the systems that had been at war with each other finally quiet. He flew back to Millhaven that night on the same Cessna Citation, with the same pilot and the same quiet cabin, except that this time the folder of diagnostic reports was gone, and in its place was a single sheet of paper, a preliminary terms outline that Aurora's assistant had printed before he left, which he'd folded twice and put in the front pocket of his canvas bag without reading again. He'd read it once in the elevator on the way down from her office and understood it well enough. The numbers on it were the kind that didn't feel real when you looked at them, the kind that required a few days of ordinary life before they settled into anything resembling reality. He looked out the window most of the flight. Below, the lights of Southern California gave way gradually to darkness, and then to the scattered lights of smaller places, the kind of towns you could see from altitude and understand immediately, the grid of them simple and legible in a way that Los Angeles never was. He thought about his father. Raymond Cole had not been a sentimental man exactly, but he had been a man with strong feelings that he expressed sideways, through action more than words, through the things he chose to teach, rather than the things he said outright. He taught Ethan to change oil at age 7, not because a 7-year-old needed to know how to change oil, but because he wanted Ethan's hands to know the feeling of a task completed correctly before his brain had time to develop opinions about what kind of tasks were worth completing. He taught him to read a wiring diagram at 9. At 11, he'd handed him the first of the notebooks and said simply, "Read this when you have a question I'm not around to answer." That was the closest Raymond Cole had ever come to saying the thing that was underneath everything he taught, which was that he knew, on some level, that he wouldn't always be there, and that the notebooks were the version of himself he could leave behind. Ethan had been 32 years old, sitting in a dead man's house in Roanoke going through a box of things, when he finally understood that. 4 years ago. He'd sat on the floor of his father's shop with the complete set of notebooks in his lap, 7 of them, filled front to back, and he'd cried in the way that men who have been holding it together cry when they finally stop holding it, badly, without dignity, for longer than felt reasonable. Then he'd put the notebooks in his canvas bag, driven back to Millhaven, and started reading them in order from the beginning. The plane landed at 11:40. He drove home in his truck, which he'd left in the small regional airport's parking lot, and pulled into his driveway at 5 minutes past midnight. The house was dark. Sandra had texted that Lily had been picked up and was asleep. He went in quietly, checked on Lily. She was in her bed in the particular configuration she always slept in, half off the pillow, one arm hanging over the side, and stood in her doorway for a minute. Then he went to the kitchen and sat at the table with the preliminary term sheet and a glass of water and read it again. He sat there for a long time. The next morning, Lily came downstairs at 7:15 and found him at the kitchen table with coffee and the notebook open in front of him, which was not an unusual thing to find. She was in her school clothes already. She dressed herself, had since she was 6, with varying degrees of success. And she dropped her backpack by the door and climbed onto the chair across from him. "Did you fix the fancy car?" she asked. "I did." "Was it hard?" He thought about it. It was confusing for a long time. Then it was clear. She considered this. "That's how math is," she said, with the authority of someone who had strong math feelings. Confusing, and then clear. Yeah, exactly like that. She reached across and turned the notebook toward her, looking at her grandfather's handwriting. She'd seen it before. She knew the notebooks existed, knew in a general way that they had belonged to her grandfather, whose photograph hung in the hallway, and who she knew primarily through the stories Ethan told, since she'd been 4 when Raymond died, and her memories of him were impressions more than events. She turned a page, looked at a diagram Raymond had drawn of overlapping system cycles, and turned it back. "Did Grandpa write that down for you?" He wrote it for himself mostly, but yeah, he left it for me. She was quiet for a moment, eating the toast she'd made herself. Slightly too dark, which she claimed to prefer, though Ethan suspected she just didn't want to admit she'd timed it wrong. Are you going to go back to the car place? Probably. We're still figuring that out. In California? Yeah. Can I come sometime? Maybe in the summer. She seemed to accept this as a reasonable answer and moved on to other subjects. Something involving a project about ecosystems and a dispute with her friend Marcus about whether coral counted as an animal. Ethan listened and responded and made her lunch while she talked, the ordinary machinery of a weekday morning running the way it always did, and tried to let that ordinariness sit in his chest alongside the other things that were sitting there. The following 2 weeks were strange in the particular way that the period after a significant thing often is. The significant thing itself was over, but the shape of it hadn't settled yet. He was back in the shop. The F250 got its transmission. The Accord's misfire turned out to be a cracked intake manifold gasket, which he fixed in an afternoon. Jake progressed to differentials under close supervision, which he took seriously enough that Ethan trusted him more than he'd expected. The phone calls with Aurora's team began, first with Daniel Hess, who was methodical and organized and who approached the consulting arrangement with the precision of someone building a spreadsheet, which was fine with Ethan. Then with a woman named Claire Navarro, who was apparently Sterling Automotive's head of talent development and who had been tasked with building the apprenticeship program. Claire Navarro was direct and fast-talking and had a quality Ethan recognized immediately. She genuinely cared about the thing she'd been asked to build, not just about building it correctly, but about what it would mean to the people it was meant for. I want to understand the candidate profile we're looking for, she said on their second call. Not the resume profile, the actual human profile. Mechanically intuitive, comfortable with ambiguity, they can't shut down when a problem doesn't have an obvious answer, patient enough to read before they touch. He paused. And generally, they've had to figure things out themselves. Not because no one helped them, but because the help they got came in the form of being shown rather than being told. The notebook, he'd sent her a scanned copy, came from a man who learned by doing and then sat down and tried to write down what he'd figured out. The people who'll learn it best are probably people who think that way. People who don't have fancy degrees. Some will, some won't. The degree's not the thing. The way they look at a problem is the thing. How do we screen for that? Give them a problem that looks simple and isn't. Put them in front of something where the obvious answer is wrong and see what they do when they figure that out. Do they double down? Do they backtrack? Do they get quiet and think? He leaned back in his chair. The ones who get quiet and think are the ones. Claire Navarro was quiet for a moment. You're describing yourself. I'm describing my father. He first went back to Hawthorne 3 weeks after the investor event, on a Tuesday in early May when the weather in Los Angeles was exactly the kind that people who lived there took entirely for granted, warm and clear with a dry breeze that made everything look slightly more defined than it deserved. He drove a rental car from LAX to the facility, which was a deliberate choice. He didn't want to be met at the airport, didn't want the production of it. The main garage felt different than it had the day he'd first walked in. The emergency energy was gone. No cavalry of laptops and diagnostic rigs arranged in crisis formation around the Bugatti. It was a working garage again. The ordinary organized activity of people doing their jobs. The sounds of it familiar to him in the way that all garages were familiar, regardless of how much more expensive the machinery was. Greg Tanner met him at the entrance. He'd clearly slept more in the past 3 weeks, which had restored some of the specific humanity to his face that 3-week sleep deprivation had been suppressing. He shook Ethan's hand with genuine warmth. Team's been looking forward to this, he said. Good. I've been thinking about how to start. How do you want to do it? I want to sit with your diagnostic team for a day and do nothing but listen. Whatever they're working on, I want to hear how they talk about it. The vocabulary people use to describe a problem tells you how they're thinking about it, and I need to know how your people think before I try to change anything. Tanner nodded, and there was something in his expression, not quite relief, but something adjacent. I was worried you were going to come in with a 2-day seminar. Those don't work, Ethan said. My father used to say you can't teach someone to feel what's wrong with a thing. You can teach them to pay attention until the thing tells them. That takes longer than 2 days. The day he spent listening was more useful than anything he could have opened with. He sat at the edge of the main diagnostic bay and observed the way they sequenced their approach, the language they used, the particular moment when a team member hit an unexpected result, and what they did next. He took notes on his legal pad, not about the cars being worked on, but about the people working on them, the patterns of thinking, the habitual moves, the places where the methodology ran out and instinct took over, and whether the instinct being used was likely to be right. He saw good mechanics, genuinely skilled people who knew their systems deeply. He also saw, several times, the thing he'd anticipated seeing, the instinct to isolate, to narrow, to look harder at the single thing rather than wider at the relationships. Not a flaw in the individuals, a flaw in the training, the framework, the entire inherited approach. They'd all been taught the same thing because it was the thing that worked most of the time. It just didn't work all of the time. He wrote on his legal pad, they trust their instruments completely. They don't ask what the instruments might be missing. At the end of that first day, Aurora found him in the same executive lounge where he'd eaten a sandwich 3 weeks ago. She came in without much ceremony, dropped into the chair across from him, and looked at his notes without asking. He let her look. "Well," she said, "your team is good, technically excellent, the way Hess described." He tapped the legal pad. "They're also trained in a way that creates a specific blind spot, same blind spot in most of them. It's not individual, it's systemic. The training produces it. Can you fix it? It's not a fix, it's an addition. You're not replacing what they know, you're building a different layer on top of it." He leaned forward, elbows on the table. "The way I want to approach this, I need to work with them on real problems. Not hypotheticals, not staged exercises. Actual vehicles with actual unresolved issues. We go through the problems together using the methodology, and they see it applied rather than explained. We have 2 vehicles in the bay right now that have been giving us trouble." "What kind of trouble?" She described them. One was an electrical gremlin in a prototype they were developing. Intermittent, inconsistent, the kind of problem that showed up on test drives but disappeared on the diagnostic rig. The other was a transmission issue in a customer vehicle that 3 of his technicians had looked at and disagreed about the cause. Ethan felt something sharpen in him, the same feeling that had sharpened in his chest on the plane going through the Bugatti reports. The feeling was focus, essentially, but it came with a physical quality, a kind of settling, like something aligning. "Good," he said. "We start tomorrow." The work that followed was not clean or quick or particularly graceful, which was probably what made it real. Real teaching, not demonstration but actual transmission of something, is ugly in the middle. People misunderstand things. They apply a principle in a situation it doesn't fit and are confused when it doesn't help. They get frustrated. They push back. On the second day, a technician named Darren, who was sharp and experienced and had clearly been the strongest voice in the diagnostic team before Ethan arrived, pushed back hard. They were working through the prototype's electrical issue, going through a mapping exercise where Ethan was asking each person to describe not the component they were checking, but what that component's behavior suggested about its relationship with the systems around it. Darren kept reframing his answers in conventional terms, describing the component's individual function, its spec rating, its test result. "I need you to try something different," Ethan said. "Forget the spec for a second. What is this component's behavior suggesting about what it's experiencing from adjacent systems?" "It's experiencing normal input," Darren said. "The test shows normal. The test shows normal in isolation. That's what tests are. Some of them are. Some of them miss things because they're measuring the component when it's alone, and the component's behavior changes when it has neighbors." Ethan set down his pen. "Walk me through how you would diagnose your own mood if you could only measure yourself in an empty room." Darren stared at him. "You'd come up normal every time," Ethan said, "because what's making you act strange isn't inside you. It's the interaction, the relationship." He picked his pen back up. "That's what we're looking for here. Same principle." A silence. Then, slowly, Darren tried again. The reframe took him several attempts, but on the fourth try, something shifted in his language. A subtle movement from describing what the component was to describing what the component seemed to be responding to. And Ethan saw the shift and wrote it down. "There," he said quietly. That's it." Darren looked at his own notes like he was surprised by them. By the end of the first week, the prototype's electrical issue had been identified as a conflict between the vehicle's adaptive suspension control module and a new thermal management system that had been installed in the latest revision. Two systems that had been tested and approved separately, but that were sharing a sensor array in a way the spec sheets hadn't flagged. The fix was elegant, once visible, a timing adjustment in the thermal system's sensor polling rate, which removed the interference window. The team that found it had used Ethan's methodology. He had not found it for them. He'd watched them find it, asked questions when they got stuck, and stayed quiet when they were moving. That distinction mattered to him in a way he couldn't fully explain but felt clearly. Greg Tanner shook his head afterward, standing over the open hood of the prototype, with the particular expression of someone who has just been shown a card trick and is deciding whether they're more impressed or more annoyed. "Same kind of thing as the Bugatti," he said. "Two systems that looked fine separately." "They're going to look the same every time," Ethan said. "That's the signature of this failure mode. If either system looked broken, someone would have found it already. So every time we can't find something obvious, we go to interaction mapping first. You go to it sooner than you have been. You don't have to wait for obvious to fail. If a problem is intermittent, inconsistent, or survives multiple single-system checks, you're probably looking at a relationship issue." Tanner wrote it down on his own notepad. Ethan noticed this and didn't say anything about it, but he noticed it. He was in Hawthorne for 8 days that first visit. He stayed in a hotel 20 minutes from the facility, a mid-range business chain that was clean and functional and deeply impersonal in the way that suited him fine. He called Lily every night. The ecosystem project had been completed and received high marks, the choral question apparently resolved in Marcus's favor by the teacher, which Lily reported with the weary dignity of someone who has accepted an unjust outcome but has not agreed with it. "Coral is an animal," she said on the 5th night. "It is," he confirmed. Marcus said it wasn't. Marcus was wrong. "The teacher said it technically is, but it doesn't seem like one." "That's not a scientific standard." "I know." A pause. "I'm not mad about it." "You sound a little mad about it." "I'm not. I've moved on." Another pause. "Are you coming home soon?" 3 more days? Okay. And then, in a slightly different register, the one she used when she was trying to sound casual about something that mattered to her. "Is the car place good?" He thought about the day he'd had, about Darren's face when his language shifted, about the prototype problem getting solved, about Greg Tanner writing things down, about sitting in a room full of skilled people and watching something move through them the way a current moves through a circuit. "Yeah," he said, "the car place is good." The arrangement had been operating for 6 weeks when the tension arrived, which was, in retrospect, about the right amount of time. Things that are going to go wrong in a new arrangement rarely go wrong in the first 2 weeks, when everyone is on their best version of themselves. They go wrong when the novelty wears off and the actual friction becomes visible. The friction, when it came from 2 directions simultaneously. The first was internal to Sterling Automotive and had to do with a senior engineer named Warren Cole, no relation to Ethan, which the universe apparently found amusing, who was the head of the company's formal engineering protocols division, and who had, very politely, begun circulating a memo about the unauthorized modification of established diagnostic procedures. Ethan heard about the memo from Greg Tanner, who delivered the information with the particular carefulness of someone who was relaying something he knew would land badly. "He's not wrong that we've changed things without going through the formal approval process," Tanner said. "And Warren has a legitimate concern about documentation and liability." "What's the real concern?" Ethan said. Tanner was quiet for a second. "Warren came up through the formal program. Advanced degree from Stuttgart. Fellowship with the German Engineering Institute. He's been the methodological authority in this company for 11 years. And now there's a new methodology. That came from a mechanic in Virginia with no formal credentials. Yeah. Tanner looked uncomfortable. I'm not saying it's right. I'm telling you what it is. Does Aurora know about the memo? She'll have it by end of day. She called him that evening. He was in the hotel room, shoes off, half a room service burger on the desk beside him. Warren's memo, she said. Tanner told me. He's not entirely wrong about the process. We should have gone through channels. She paused. He's entirely wrong about the substance. He hasn't said anything about the substance yet. He will. Her voice had a dry, tired edge that he recognized as someone who had dealt with institutional resistance before and had learned to identify it early. Warren is good at what he does. He's also been the only methodological voice in this building for 11 years, and you walked in here and changed that in 6 weeks. That's not a small thing to someone who cares about their position. I'm not interested in anyone's position. I know that. Warren doesn't know that yet. What do you want me to do? Nothing yet. I want to handle it first. A brief silence. But I'm going to want you to meet with him. Not to convince him. I don't need him convinced. But I want you in the same room with him at least once before this calcifies into something harder to deal with. The second source of friction was closer to home, and in some ways harder. Jake called him on a Wednesday afternoon while Ethan was in a system mapping session with 2 of Sterling's newer technicians. He let it go to voicemail. Jake called again 10 minutes later. He excused himself and stepped out. What's happening? He said. Mr. Patterson came in. Jake's voice had the specific tightness of a young person trying to sound more calm than they were. His truck again. The transmission. What about it? He says it's slipping. He says it was fine when he left here, and now it's slipping, and he wants to know what we did wrong. Ethan leaned against the wall of the corridor. When did he pick it up? 11 days ago. What are the conditions? Highway driving, city, what? He didn't say. He's not happy, Ethan. Is the truck here now? Yes. Tell him I'll call him in an hour. Don't tell him what I'm doing. Just tell him I'm dealing with something and I'll call in an hour. He paused. Did you look at the transmission? I didn't want to touch it without you. Take a fluid sample, check the color and the smell, and write down what you see. Don't diagnose it, just document it. Can you do that? A slightly steadying exhale on the other end. Yeah, I can do that. He called Patterson from a quiet corner near the facility's loading dock 45 minutes later. The man was unhappy, which was his right. The truck was slipping in third gear on highway on-ramps, which was specific enough to work with. It didn't sound like anything Ethan had done. The transmission he'd rebuilt was a different component from the issue Patterson was describing, and the symptoms were more consistent with a worn torque converter than with a freshly rebuilt transmission behaving badly. But he'd been wrong before, and the only way to know was to have hands on it. I'll look at it myself when I'm back Thursday, Ethan said. If it's something we did, I'll fix it at no charge, and I'll tell you exactly what happened. Patterson was quiet for a moment. You're in California. On business, I'll be back Thursday. People keep telling me you're getting fancy. I'm consulting for an automotive company, Ethan said. I'll be back Thursday, and I'll fix your truck. Another pause. Patterson made a sound that wasn't quite mollified, but was somewhere in that direction. Thursday. He went back inside with the particular mild headache that came from managing 2 very different things simultaneously and stood in the corridor for a minute before returning to the session. The building around him hummed with its air handling system, the controlled temperature of a facility that had been designed for precision. Through the glass wall at the end of the corridor, he could see the garage floor. His 2 technicians visible at their workbench, waiting for him, their heads bent over the materials he'd given them, and one of them apparently explaining something to the other in the animated way of someone who was genuinely engaged with what they were doing. He watched them for a moment. Then he went back in. The meeting with Warren Cole happened on a Friday morning, in a conference room that was clearly Warren's preferred territory. A formal space with a long table and a wall of whiteboards that were covered in the dense, systematic notation of a man who thought in structured frameworks. Warren was in his mid-50s, German-educated, with the particular self-possession of someone who had spent decades being the authority in every room he walked into. He was not hostile. He He was, if anything, scrupulously polite in a way that communicated exactly as much respect as he'd decided to extend, and not a milligram more. "I want to be direct," Warren said, almost immediately after they sat down. "I have questions about the methodological validity of what's being introduced to this team." "Ask them," Ethan said. "The systems conflict approach. Oh, I understand the logic. Interaction mapping, cross-system analysis, parallel monitoring, none of that is conceptually novel. What I don't understand is why it was presented as a superior alternative to established diagnostic protocol rather than a supplemental tool. I didn't present it as superior. I presented it as a tool for a specific class of problems that existing protocol doesn't cover well. Intermittent faults. Intermittent faults caused by cross-system interaction, specifically, where both systems appear individually normal." Warren looked at him steadily. "Do you have data on the failure rate of existing protocol for that specific class?" 23 days and 212 specialists failing to diagnose a Bugatti, Ethan said. "That's the data I walked in with. That's one case. It's one case in this company. The methodology has been applied in a one-man shop in Virginia for 38 years. The case history in those notebooks goes back to 1986. Anecdotal." "Yes," Ethan said simply. "It is. So is everything until someone formalizes it." He leaned forward slightly. "What I'm suggesting is that we do exactly that. Document the methodology rigorously, run it in parallel with existing protocol on a defined set of cases, collect data, and let the data determine how it gets incorporated." He paused. "That's not a workaround of your process. That is your process." Warren was quiet. Something had shifted in him. Not surrendered, but engaged. The look of a man who was considering an argument he hadn't expected. "You'd be willing to submit it to formal validation." "I'd expect it," Ethan said. "My father's methodology should be able to survive scrutiny. If it can't, it shouldn't be in this company's protocol." Another silence, longer. Warren turned his pen over in his hands, a thinking gesture. "The notebook your father kept," he said. "I read the scan that was circulated." He said this carefully, like he was measuring how much to give. The phenomenological approach he describes in Section 4, the way he categorizes conflict signatures by behavioral pattern rather than component type. That's genuinely original work. Ethan looked at him. "Yeah." "Did he have any formal training in systems theory?" "No. He developed this from observation. From doing the work, reading what he could find, and writing down what didn't fit anywhere else." Warren turned the pen over again. "I want to be included in the validation process," he said finally, "not as an obstacle, as a participant." "That's exactly where I'd want you," Ethan said. It wasn't friendship, it wasn't even warmth exactly, but it was something real. Two people with different kinds of knowledge deciding to put them in the same room and see what happened. Ethan had dealt with enough territorial friction in his life to recognize when it was starting to dissolve, and this was the beginning of dissolving. He flew back to Millhaven that afternoon. He drove from the airport with the windows down, the cool Virginia spring coming in through the truck, the familiar landscape doing what familiar landscapes do when you've been away from them, reasserting themselves, reminding you of what they are in a way they never bother to do when you haven't left. The sign for Millhaven came up, and he felt his shoulders drop about a quarter inch. He picked up Lily from Sandra's, where she was in the backyard apparently teaching the dog the paw trick now, which was an advancement. She ran across the grass to him, and he caught her, and she was the exact weight she always was, which was somehow always slightly surprising, the way the specific reality of your kid always reasserts itself after even a short absence as its own irreducible fact. "You're back," she said, into his shoulder. "I'm back." "Did you fix things?" He held her for a second before setting her down. "Making progress." She considered this. "Is that a yes?" "It's a this. Takes time." She made a face that said she'd accepted this answer and filed it as insufficient. "Mr. Patterson called the house." "Yeah." He seemed upset. "I know. I'm fixing his truck tomorrow." She looked at him. "You just got home." I know. You haven't eaten dinner. I'll eat first. She seemed to weigh this. Sandra made extra soup. She said to take the container. Of course she did. They walked back across the grass toward Sandra's back door. The dog followed them. Behind the neighbor's fence, someone was mowing a lawn in the last of the evening light, the smell of cut grass mixing with whatever Sandra had been cooking, the sounds of Millhaven settling into its evening, a kid on a bike somewhere, a car passing on the main road 2 blocks over. Ethan carried his daughter's backpack in one hand and thought about Warren Cole's expression when he'd agreed to the validation process, and about Darren's face when his language finally shifted, and about a notebook covered in careful handwriting that had been sitting in a box for 4 years waiting to matter. It was mattering now. Slowly, with friction, with the particular messiness of real things in real situations. But it was mattering. He took the soup container from Sandra, thanked her, and walked home with his daughter in the direction of a house he'd bought with 12 years of honest work, on a street in a town that most of the world had never heard of, carrying a dead man's ideas toward the future those ideas deserved. Patterson's truck turned out to be the torque converter, exactly as Ethan had suspected. Not anything Sterling's work had touched, a separate failure, the kind that happened to high-mileage trucks on their own schedule, regardless of what any mechanic had or hadn't done. He told Patterson this clearly, showed him the worn component, explained the difference between what had been rebuilt 3 weeks ago and what had failed now. Patterson listened with the slightly defensive posture of a man who had come in ready to be angry and was recalibrating. "So it's not your fault," Patterson said finally. "No, but it still needs fixing." "What's that going to cost me?" Ethan gave him the number. Patterson winced, which was the correct response to the number. "When can you have it done?" "Tuesday." Patterson stood there for another moment, looking at the truck the way people look at things that keep costing them money, with a mixture of resentment and resignation. "People in town say you're going to California all the time now." "A few times, yeah." "You going to keep the shop?" "Yes," Ethan said without hesitation. Patterson looked at him. Something in the directness of the answer seemed to satisfy him more than any elaboration would have. He nodded once and went to wait in his truck while Ethan wrote up the work order. And that was the end of that particular anxiety. The one that had been sitting low and quiet under everything else for the past 6 weeks. The worry that the people in Millhaven who'd trusted him with their vehicles would feel the ground shifting under a relationship built on the assumption that he wasn't going anywhere. He was going places now, regularly, and he was coming back. He was still figuring out how to carry both things at once, without either one suffering. Most days he managed it. Some days it was just heavy. The formal validation process Warren had agreed to began in June, which was 3 months after the investor event, and felt, in the way that institutional timelines always feel, both too slow and too fast. Too slow because Ethan could see what the methodology was doing in the garage already. The way thinking had shifted. The new questions people were asking before they reached for diagnostic tools. And he wanted that change anchored, formalized, protected. Too fast because documentation is different from doing, and translating his father's intuitive, handwritten system into a format that could survive academic scrutiny without losing what made it real was harder than he'd expected. Claire Navarro had started the documentation process and quickly discovered the same problem. She called him on a Tuesday evening while he was making dinner, and the sound in her voice was the specific frustration of a very organized person confronting something that resisted organization. "The notebook doesn't translate cleanly," she said. "The methodology works in practice. We've watched it work. The teams are using it. We can see the outcomes. But when I try to write it as a formal protocol document, it flattens. The logic is still there, but something essential goes missing." Ethan turned the burner down. "What goes missing?" "The judgment part. The part where your father says things like, 'Ask the car what it's afraid of,' or 'Listen for the argument, not the malfunction.' I can't put that in a protocol document. It sounds like folklore." "It is folklore," he said. "That's what it is. It's craft knowledge. The kind that doesn't live in documents, it lives in people. I need it to live in a document for Warren's validation process." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "Let me try something. Give me a week." What he tried was this. He went back through the notebooks, all 7 of them, and did what his father had never done. He separated the observational passages from the procedural ones. Raymond had written them together, the way you think when you're thinking, the intuitions and the systematic steps mixed up in the same paragraphs. Ethan had always read them that way, absorbing both as a unit. But what Claire needed was the procedural skeleton extracted cleanly, in language that could be formalized, while preserving enough of the observational context that the person following the procedure understood why each step existed. It took him 11 days, not 7, working evenings after Lily went to bed. He sat at the kitchen table with the notebooks and a laptop and wrote slowly, reading a passage, sitting with it, then writing the formal version and the explanatory note separately. He was not a natural writer. Some nights he wrote 3 sentences in 2 hours. Some nights he rewrote the same procedure 4 times before it said what he needed it to say. But the thing that came out of it, 41 pages, which he sent to Claire on a Wednesday morning, was something he thought his father would have recognized. He wasn't sure Raymond would have liked it exactly. Formalization would have felt like a kind of pinning to a man who'd always preferred his knowledge, breathing, and flexible. But he thought Raymond would have understood why it was necessary. Would have understood that if you want something to go further than one pair of hands, you eventually have to let someone else hold it. Claire called him 2 hours after he sent the document. "This is it," she said. "It's a draft. It's what I needed. Warren's team can work with this." She paused. "One thing. There's a section, page 23, the part about conflict signature identification. You wrote a note at the bottom that says this part cannot be fully proceduralized. It requires supervised practice to develop. I want to talk about how we handle that." "That note is the most important thing in the document," Ethan said. "Don't remove it and don't try to fill it in. The apprenticeship program exists precisely because some parts of this can only be transmitted person to person. If you take that note out, you're pretending the document is more complete than it is, and eventually someone will follow the procedure and miss something and not know why." A silence on her end. "You're saying the gap in the methodology is intentional. I'm saying it's honest. The gap is the reason there needs to be a program. It's not a flaw to be patched. It's the argument for everything we're building." That reframing became eventually central to how Claire presented the apprenticeship program to the Sterling board. Not as a remediation initiative for people who lacked credentials, but as a program designed specifically to transmit the part of the methodology that could not be captured in a document. The gap was the feature. The human transmission was not a workaround for an incomplete system. It was the system's most important component. The board meeting where this was presented happened in mid-July, and Ethan was in the building when it occurred, though not in the room. He was in the garage working with Greg Tanner's team on a particularly stubborn fault in a new prototype when Aurora came down to the garage floor 2 hours after the meeting had started. And he knew by the way she walked that it had gone well. Not celebration in her posture, because she wasn't built for visible celebration, but a specific looseness in her movement that meant she wasn't bracing against anything. She came to stand beside him at the workbench. He was in the middle of explaining something to a technician named Rosa, who was 26 and had been hired 6 months ago straight out of a community college automotive program, and who had turned out to be one of the sharpest instincts in the room. He finished the explanation, let Rosa sit with it, then turned to Aurora. "Board approved," she said. Quietly, so it didn't carry across the floor. "How many against?" 2 abstentions, no votes against. The abstentions were procedural. They wanted the validation data finalized before they fully committed. Warren convinced them the process was sound. Warren convinced them. She looked at him with a slight lift of her eyebrow. "He's been the methodological authority in this company for 11 years. When he says the new methodology is worth formalizing, people listen." Ethan turned that over. He still hadn't fully understood Warren Cole. The man remained somewhat opaque to him, his internal workings more concealed than most. But over the past 2 months, something had developed between them that wasn't warmth, but was a kind of mutual acknowledgement. They'd had 3 working sessions together around the documentation, sitting at the long conference table in Warren's territory, going through the 41 pages systematically. Warren asked precise questions. Ethan answered them as precisely as he could. Sometimes Warren would push back, and Ethan would either push back harder or concede, and Warren seemed to respect both responses roughly equally. At the end of their second session, Warren had said, almost as an aside, "Your father worked in isolation for 38 years. Yes. And never sought formal validation for any of this. He wasn't built for that. The shop was enough for him. The work was the thing." Warren had been quiet for a moment. Then, "That's a waste," he said. Not cruelly, with something that sounded genuinely like grief, from a man who had spent his career building the kind of structure that would have supported what Raymond Cole had done, and was sitting with the fact that the two things had missed each other by decades. That kind of thinking, developed in isolation, anything could have happened to it. It could have died with him. "Almost did," Ethan said. Warren looked at him. Almost. Standing now beside Aurora on the garage floor, Ethan watched Rosa work through the prototype problem with the focused patience of someone who was genuinely built for this. The quiet quality of her attention, the way she came at the problem from two angles before committing to either one. He'd seen that quality in her from the first week. He'd been watching it sharpen. "The first apprentice cohort," he said. "When does Claire want to start?" "September. She's been reviewing applications for 3 weeks, 12 spots." "How many applications?" 347. Aurora looked at him. "From 22 states. After we posted the program description, the real one, with your father's name on it, it went somewhere. People shared it." He hadn't known the numbers. He absorbed them quietly. "There's a letter," Aurora said, "in the applications. From a kid in Memphis, 18 years old. He's been working in his uncle's shop since he was 12. He wrote, I'm paraphrasing, that he'd always been told there was no path for people who learned the way he learned, in shops and under hoods instead of in classrooms, and that when he read about your father's methodology, he felt like someone had finally described the way his own brain worked." She paused. "Claire cried reading it, which she'll deny." Ethan didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at the workbench, at the legal pad with its maps and circles, at his own handwriting layered over echoes of his father's thinking. "Is he in?" he asked. "He's on the short list. Claire wants your input on the final 12. I'd like to read his application." "I'll have her send it." He went back to Rosa and the prototype. The morning moved on. The garage had its sounds around them. The ordinary work sounds of people doing things they knew how to do, punctuated occasionally by the specific kind of silence that meant someone had hit something unexpected and was thinking about it. Ethan had come to love that silence. It was the silence of real engagement, of a mind encountering resistance and not bouncing off. The complication that arrived in August was not a professional one. It came from a direction Ethan had not been tracking, which was maybe why it hit harder than it might have. Her name was Diana, and she had been Lily's second-grade teacher, and she called him on a Thursday evening, which turned out not to be about Lily at all. He'd met her at a school event in the spring, briefly, in the way you meet people at school events. Mostly distracted, mostly managing logistics, retaining primarily a general impression of competence and directness. She'd left a message, which he almost didn't listen to, because he was tired and had 3 more things to do before he could sleep. He listened to it. She was calling, she said, because a mutual acquaintance had mentioned he might have room in his schedule for a consultation. Her brother had a 1972 Chevrolet Corvette that had been giving 2 other shops fits. She apologized for reaching out cold. She said she hoped it wasn't an imposition. He called her back more because of the Corvette than anything else. They talked for 40 minutes, which was 35 minutes longer than a Corvette consultation required. The Corvette got resolved in the first 5 minutes. He could tell from her description that it was almost certainly a carburetor issue, probably the accelerator pump. And then the conversation went somewhere else. The way conversations occasionally do when both people suddenly notice they're still on the phone and neither one has started wrapping up. She was 34. She'd grown up in North Carolina and come to Millhaven 3 years ago when the teaching position opened. She had a dry sense of humor that she deployed without warning, which he respected. She asked good questions. She asked him about the California work in a way that made it clear she'd heard about it in the approximate way that everything in Millhaven circulated, which was informally and with varying accuracy, and she wanted to know the real version. He told her more of the real version than he'd told most people in Millhaven, which he didn't fully notice until after he'd hung up and was sitting in the kitchen with the awareness that the call had been longer than he'd expected and that he'd been not guarded exactly, but less guarded than usual. He sat with that for a while. Then he called Sandra. "Do you know a Diana Reeves, second grade teacher?" "Of course I know Diana Reeves. This is a town of 11,000 people." A pause. "Why do you know Diana Reeves?" "She called about a Corvette." "Ethan, it's a legitimate consultation." "I'm sure it is." He could hear the smile in her voice, which he found mildly irritating. "She's lovely. She coaches the girls' soccer team on Saturdays. Her brother does have a Corvette, so that part is real." "Are you going to ask her to bring it in?" "Probably." "And maybe have a conversation that isn't about a Corvette." "Sandra, I'm just noting the possibility exists." He didn't say anything. "Ethan, it's been 5 years." "I know how long it's been." Lily would not be traumatized by her father having a "Good night, Sandra." "Good night." A beat. "She's lovely," she said again, and hung up. He put the phone down and looked at the kitchen table, at the spot where the notebooks lived when he wasn't carrying them somewhere. The house was quiet. Lily had been asleep for an hour. The refrigerator made its sound. Outside, the street had the particular quality of a Millhaven summer night. Still, warm, the occasional car passing in no hurry. He wasn't the kind of person who spent a lot of time thinking about his own life with any distance. The day-to-day had always been sufficient, and full enough that stepping back to look at the shape of things didn't happen naturally. But Sandra's voice had the effect of occasionally forcing that perspective, the way a level pressed against a wall shows you what you'd stopped noticing. 5 years since Lily's mother had left. 5 years of the shop and Sandra's kitchen and school pickups, and the notebooks and Lily asking sharp questions about science and the world. It had been enough, mostly. It had been real, which is different from enough but sometimes substitutes. He went to bed without resolving anything, which was probably the right response. The Corvette came in on a Saturday morning. It was in fact the carburetor, specifically the accelerator pump, exactly as he'd guessed. He had it running correctly in 3 hours, which he was slightly annoyed by because 3 hours was fast enough that it left him in the awkward position of having finished before he'd figured out what he was doing with the rest of the morning. Diana Reeves came to pick it up at noon. She was taller than he'd half remembered, with the kind of comfortable self-possession that came from a decade of managing rooms full of 8-year-olds who would immediately detect any performance of authority. She looked at the car, asked him to explain what he'd found, and followed the explanation with genuine attention. She asked 2 follow-up questions that showed she'd actually absorbed the first part, which was rarer than it should be. Which? He showed her the carburetor component he'd replaced. She turned it over in her hand. "How did you know that was it from just my description on the phone?" she asked. "The specific way you described the hesitation, the pause before the engine caught on acceleration, that's a pretty distinctive signature for an accelerator pump issue." "So it wasn't a guess?" "Never is. It might have been something else, but the description pointed there first." She handed the component back. She had, he noticed, engine grease on her hand now, which she looked at with mild interest rather than the faint alarm that most people in non-mechanical professions would bring to the discovery of grease on their hand. "Your daughter is in 3rd grade now," she said, which was a slight redirect, or maybe not. Maybe just the way her mind moved from one thing to another without necessarily signaling the connection. "She's remarkable. I had her for 1 session last year when Mrs. Porter was out. She told me in very certain terms that the way we were doing the science exercise was inefficient." "That sounds right." She was also correct, which was impressive and slightly deflating. She looked at him with a slight smile that was more in her eyes than her mouth. "She talks about you a lot, and about her grandfather." That landed unexpectedly. He kept his expression even, but he felt it. "She does?" "She told me about the notebooks, about how he wrote everything down. She has this quality of finding certain things important in a way that's completely non-negotiable. The notebooks are in that category." He looked at the Corvette. "She's never said much to me about caring about them specifically." "She's 8. 8-year-olds don't always say the things directly. They say them sideways." She picked up her keys from the counter. "She told me specifically, 'My grandpa figured out something really important, and my dad is making sure it doesn't get lost.'" A pause. I thought you'd want to know someone said that. He was quiet for a moment. Thank you. Of course. She moved toward the car, then half turned. Can I ask you something that's not about the carburetor? Go ahead. Does Millhaven feel different to you now than it did before California? It was a more direct question than he'd expected. He thought about it honestly. Yes and no. The town is the same, my daughter is the same, the shop is the same. He paused. I'm a little different, maybe. I see it a little differently. How? Like I'm choosing it, he said. Before it was just where I was. Now it feels like where I decided to be, which is a different thing. She held that for a moment. Then she nodded. Not the polite nod that means someone is waiting for you to finish talking, but the actual nod of someone who understood what you said and agreed with it. That's a good distinction, she said. She got in the Corvette. It started clean and strong. She rolled the window down. What do I owe you? He told her the number. She paid him, in cash, from an envelope that suggested her brother had anticipated this, and drove the car out of the bay. He stood in the open garage door and listened to the Corvette's engine fade down the street and around the corner. Then he went back inside and found Jake waiting at the workbench with a slightly studied casualness that meant he'd been watching through the window. She's nice, Jake said, too neutrally. Her brother's carburetor was shot. Right. Jake busied himself unnecessarily with a socket wrench. She have other cars? Jake? Just asking. Find something to do. Jake found something to do, suppressing what was definitely a smirk, and Ethan went to his desk in the small office off the bay and sat down and looked at the stack of apprenticeship applications Claire had sent him. 42 shortlisted candidates, from which they needed to select 12. He'd been putting this off not because he didn't want to do it, but because he wanted to do it right. And doing it right was going to require sitting with each one long enough to actually see the person behind the paperwork. He started with the Memphis application. The kid's name was Darius Webb. No relation to Marcus, as far as he could tell. 18 years old, had been working in his uncle's shop in South Memphis since he was 12. He'd gotten his high school diploma through night school while working 30 hours a week. His grades were inconsistent, strong in practical subjects, less so in the abstract academic ones. His teacher recommendations were written with the particular enthusiasm of people describing someone they'd noticed in a way that went beyond the ordinary. One of them, from a Votech instructor, said, Darius doesn't just fix what's broken. He wants to understand why it broke. That question drives him in a way I've rarely seen. Attached to the application was the letter Aurora had paraphrased. He read the actual version. It was handwritten, not typed and printed. Handwritten, in a careful hand that was working slightly too hard to be legible, the hand of someone who didn't write formally very often, but was making the effort because the thing they were writing felt like it deserved the effort. The letter described growing up watching his uncle fix cars, learning to listen to engines the way other people learn to listen to music. It described the particular frustration of knowing things that weren't taught in classrooms, of having knowledge that didn't fit in the boxes that institutions provided for knowledge. It described reading about the Raymond Cole diagnostic methodology and something opening up, some interior door that had been closed so long he'd stopped trying it. He sat with it for a long time. Then he wrote Darius Webb's name at the top of a clean page on his legal pad and drew a circle around it. He was still going through applications 2 hours later when his phone rang. Aurora. Bad timing? She asked. I'm going through the applications. Anything standing out? Memphis, he said. I thought so. A pause. I'm calling because something came up today that you need to know about. Nothing catastrophic, but relevant. He waited. A journalist. She covers the automotive industry for a publication. Significant one. She's been working on a piece about Sterling's recovery from the Bugatti crisis. She knows about you. He heard Aurora pick something up on her end, set it down. She wants to interview you. She's been talking to people at the facility, and she's already got the outline of the story. The single-father mechanic from Virginia who solved what 200 specialists couldn't. She's going to write it with or without your participation. What does she know? Your name, your town, the broad strokes of what happened in the garage. She hasn't published yet because she wants your side of it. A pause. I wanted you to know before she contacts you directly. She may already have your number. Ethan put his pen down. He looked at the legal pad, at Darius Webb's circled name, at the stack of applications beside it. "What do you think I should do?" he asked. "I think you should talk to her," Aurora said. "I think the story is going to happen either way, and a story with your voice in it is better than a story without it. And I think—" She stopped for just a second, which was unusual for her. "I think your father's methodology is about to become known in a way that it wasn't, and the story of where it came from matters." He sat with that. "Raymond Cole," he said. Not a question, just the name, said out loud in the quiet of his small office in a garage in a town most people had never heard of. "Raymond Cole," Aurora confirmed, gently, the way she sometimes was when she'd surprised him by being gentle. He looked out through the office window at the garage bay, where Jake was doing something unnecessarily complicated with a tool organization system that did not need reorganizing, because Jake dealt with slow moments by rearranging things. The afternoon light came in at a low angle through the open bay door and laid itself across the concrete floor in a long, flat rectangle. Outside that rectangle, beyond the bay door, Millhaven went about its Saturday. Somewhere out there, a Corvette was running right for the first time in months. Somewhere further, a woman was coaching a soccer practice. In California, a folder of applications from 22 states sat in Claire Navarro's office, 347 people who had found a description of their own thinking in the work of a man from Roanoke who had never sought to be found. "Okay," Ethan said. "I'll talk to her." The journalist's name was Helen Park, and she called on a Monday morning while Ethan was underneath a Subaru Outback with a failing CV joint. He heard his phone buzz twice on the workbench, ignored it, finished what he was doing, and called her back 40 minutes later with grease on his hands and the particular mental state of someone who has been thinking about a call while doing something that required his hands but not his full brain. She was direct, which he appreciated. She told him what she had, what she was writing, and what she wanted from him. She didn't dress it up or soften it into something other than what it was. "The story I have right now is impressive," she said. "Single father, small town, impossible problem. It writes itself. But the story I want to write is about the methodology, about your father. That story is more interesting and more important, and I can't write it correctly without you." "What publication?" he asked. She told him. It was a significant one, the kind that automotive industry people read the way doctors read medical journals, seriously and completely. He'd seen it in his father's shop, back issues stacked on a shelf near the service desk. Raymond reading them during slow hours with the careful attention he gave anything that might contain something useful. "How long do you need?" "A proper interview. 2 hours, maybe more. I'd also like to see the shop. I'd like to understand where you came from before I write about where you ended up." He wasn't entirely comfortable with that, but he understood why she wanted it. The context mattered. "When?" "Whenever works for you. I'll come to Millhaven." She came on a Wednesday 2 weeks later, driving a rental car that she parked slightly crooked in front of the shop in a way that suggested she was not a person who thought much about parking. She was in her early 40s, with the particular energy of someone who moved through the world at a pace slightly faster than most situations required. She had a notebook, actual paper, not a device, and a voice recorder she placed on the workbench between them with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times. She looked around the shop first without asking questions, just taking it in. The tool organization. The framed picture of a 1967 Mustang on the wall that had been there when Ethan's father gave him his first set of sockets at age 7 and that Ethan had kept because removing it had never seemed like the right thing to do. The coffee maker, which was old and which made excellent coffee because he'd cleaned it more times than was probably necessary. The legal pad on the desk, the current one, half filled with notes from the apprenticeship candidate reviews. "This is a real shop," she said. "What were you expecting?" "I don't know, something more—" She seemed to be choosing the word carefully. "Curated, for someone who's been in the press for the past 2 months." "I haven't been in the press." "You have, a little, automotive industry press. Your name has been in 3 pieces already, all of them brief, all of them describing you primarily as the mechanic who fixed Aurora Sterling's Bugatti. Which is true, but it's about 12% of the actual story." He pulled 2 stools up and they sat. She opened her notebook. He told her to go ahead. The interview lasted 3.5 hours. She asked better questions than he'd expected, which meant she'd done real preparation. She'd clearly read the 41-page methodology document, or at least a significant portion of it, and her questions moved between the technical and the personal in a way that didn't feel manipulative but did feel purposeful. She wasn't trying to create a character. She was trying to understand one. She asked about Raymond early, and he answered carefully at first, and then less carefully as the conversation moved, because there was something in the way she listened that made carefulness feel unnecessary. She didn't react to things the way journalists in his imagination had always reacted, with a slight lean forward when something emotionally resonant came up, a trained display of engagement. She just listened, made notes, and occasionally asked a follow-up that showed she'd heard everything, including the things between the words. "What do you think your father would make of all this?" she asked at one point. Ethan looked at his coffee cup. He'd be embarrassed by the attention and privately pleased about the methodology being used. In that order. He paused. He was the kind of person who wanted his ideas to matter more than he wanted to matter himself, which sounds noble, but it was also sometimes just avoidance. He wasn't great at being seen. "And you?" "I'm better at it than he was. Not great." She smiled at that. It was a real one. The apprenticeship program, 12 kids starting in September. What do you want for them that's different from what the industry currently offers? "I want them to start with the questions before the tools," he said. "The standard training puts the tool in someone's hand on day one. Here's the diagnostic scanner. Here's how to read the output. And that's important. You have to know the tools. But if that's where you start, you train people to look for what the tools can show them and miss everything the tools don't know how to measure." He shifted on the stool. "My father's first rule was, before you open the hood, ask what the car has already told you. By the time it's in your bay, it's been telling someone something for weeks. The sounds, the behaviors, the particular way a failure develops. That's data. It's just data in a language that doesn't show up on a screen." Helen Park wrote something in her notebook. Then she looked up. "That's a teachable skill?" "Parts of it are. Parts of it, you either develop it or you don't. The program's honest about that. The document is honest about it." He thought about the note on page 23, the gap that was the argument for the program. Not everyone who goes through it will end up with the full range, but everyone who goes through it will think differently about what information looks like and where it lives. That's enough to make the program worth doing. "And the kid from Memphis," she said, "Darius Webb. You selected him. He made the cut on his own merits. I didn't give him special consideration. But you noticed him specifically." "Yes." He was quiet for a second. "He wrote his application letter by hand. That wasn't required. Most people typed theirs. He wrote his because he thought the thing deserved it. That told me something about how he approaches things that feel important to him." She wrote that down. When she left, 3.5 hours after she'd arrived, she stood in the parking lot next to her slightly crooked rental car and looked at the shop front for a moment. "Can I ask you something off the record?" "Sure." "Are you happy?" It was a simple question, the kind that's harder to answer than complicated ones because there's nowhere to hide in it. He stood in the bay door with the afternoon behind him and considered it honestly. "Most days," he said. "Some days I'm tired and my back hurts, and I miss my father, and I worry about Lily, and I wonder if I'm doing the California thing right or just performing doing it right." He looked at the street. "But most days, yeah. I'm doing what I think I'm supposed to be doing. That's close enough to happy for me." She nodded like that was the answer she'd expected, or at least respected. She got in the car. "The piece runs in 6 weeks," she said through the open window. "I'll send you a copy before it publishes, not for approval, just so you're not surprised." "I appreciate that." She drove away, still slightly crooked in the lane, until she straightened out, and he watched the rental car until it turned the corner. Then he went back inside and finished the CV joint. September came, and with it the first cohort, 12 of them. They arrived at the Sterling Automotive facility on a Tuesday morning, 12 people who had nothing in common on paper and a great deal in common in the ways that didn't show up on paper. Darius Webb was the youngest at 18. The oldest was a 31-year-old woman named Teresa from rural Oklahoma who had been running her family's agricultural equipment repair operation since her father's stroke 2 years ago and who had applied to the program, as she put it in her letter, because she kept encountering failures that made no sense until they suddenly did, and she wanted to understand why. There were 12 different states represented. 3 of the 12 had college degrees. 4 had not completed high school in the traditional sense. All 12 had the quality Ethan had described to Claire, the ability to get quiet and think when the obvious answer failed. He stood in front of them on the first morning in the main diagnostic bay, with the Bugatti visible in the background. It lived there now, a kind of permanent presence, used occasionally for demonstrations, but mostly just existing in the space as a reminder of the problem that had started everything. And he felt the particular weight of a moment that was bigger than the moment before it, and different from what would come after. He'd thought about what to say. He'd drafted things and discarded them. In the end, he said what felt true. Before we start, I want to tell you something about the man whose methodology you're here to learn. Raymond Cole never stood in a room like this. He never had 12 people in front of him waiting to learn from him. He ran a one-man shop in Roanoke, Virginia for 38 years, and almost nobody outside of his customers ever knew his name. He paused. That's not a story about being overlooked, though it partly is. It's a story about what knowledge is worth, regardless of whether anyone is watching. He developed this system because he needed it, because the work demanded it, and he was too stubborn to settle for not understanding things. He wrote it down because he thought clearly enough to want his thinking to survive him. Another pause. It survived him. You're the reason it's going to go further than that. Darius Webb was in the front row. He had the look of someone trying to hold a composed expression over feelings that were running faster than the expression could manage. Ethan made brief eye contact with him just for a second and then moved on. We're going to start with a problem, he said. Not an explanation of a methodology, not a history of how we got here. A problem. Vehicle in Bay 3. It's been in there since yesterday. Some of you are going to look at it today and not know what to do, and that's fine. Knowing what to do is what you're here to learn, not what you're supposed to already have. But I want to see how you look at it before I teach you anything. What questions you ask, in what order, with no framework yet. He looked at them. Go. They went. He watched. What he saw in those first hours was exactly what he'd expected, and also somehow more than he'd expected. The range of natural instincts, the variety of first moves, the places where each person ran out of their current thinking and had to stop. Teresa from Oklahoma moved around the vehicle slowly before she touched anything, which was instinctively correct, and suggested she was already asking what the car could tell her before she started checking things. Darius went straight for the diagnostic port, which was the trained reflex, the thing he'd been doing in his uncle's shop, then stopped himself halfway and looked at the port for a moment and put his hands in his pockets and stood back, as if he'd caught himself doing the thing he knew and decided to try something else instead. Ethan made notes, not grades, observations. What each person's natural instinct revealed about their thinking. The teaching that followed over those first weeks was not clean. It was 2 steps forward and 1 step backward, and occasionally 1 step sideways into territory that hadn't been on any map. Some of the 12 picked up the interaction mapping framework quickly and then struggled with the judgment component. They could map the relationships between systems, but then over-relied on the map and missed things the map didn't capture. Others were the reverse, strong, intuitive readers of complex situations, but resistant to the discipline of systematic documentation, wanting to jump to the answer and fill in the reasoning backward. Ethan had both problems himself at different times and recognized them. The documentation instinct had come from his father, who had written things down obsessively, precisely because his natural tendency was to hold it all in his head. The intuition had also come from his father, in the way it always does, not through instruction, but through proximity, through being around a person who thought a certain way until the thinking became ambient. He caught himself sometimes in the middle of explaining something to one of the 12, using a phrase his father had used. Not a formal phrase from the notebooks, something offhand, conversational, the kind of thing Raymond had said at a workbench on a Tuesday without knowing he was saying something worth keeping. And then the phrase would land in the room and someone would write it down, and Ethan would feel the strange recursive quality of the moment. His father's thinking moving through him, through his voice, into 12 other people who would carry it further. Greg Tanner ran sessions twice a week alongside Ethan, bringing the formal technical rigor that Ethan sometimes underweighted. Warren Cole came in once in the third week for a session on documentation methodology. He was more natural with the cohort than Ethan had expected, precise and demanding in the way that communicated respect for what they were capable of, rather than skepticism about whether they belonged there. Darius asked Warren 3 questions in a row that were genuinely sharp, and Warren answered each one fully, without the slight condescension that Ethan had braced for. After the session, Warren stopped beside Ethan in the corridor. "The web kid," he said. "I know," Ethan said. "He understands the framework at a level that the documentation doesn't fully support yet. He's intuiting things we haven't written down. He's working from the same instinct my father worked from." Warren looked at him. "You should put him in a room with an unresolved problem before the formal curriculum gets to that point. Let him show you what he sees before the framework shapes it." It was the best pedagogical suggestion anyone had offered since the program started. "Yeah," Ethan said. "Good call." Warren started to walk away, then paused. He had a habit of doing this, seeming to leave and then adding the thing he'd actually wanted to say. "The validation data comes back from the external review board next month for the methodology." He looked at the floor, then back at Ethan, with the slight stiffness of a man saying something that cost him something. "The preliminary indicators are strong, unusually strong." The board's lead reviewer described Section 4 as a genuine contribution to diagnostic systems theory. Ethan was quiet. "Your father's name is on the document," Warren said. "That review will cite it." "I know. I wanted you to hear that it's going to be said in the right rooms by the right people." Another pause. "He deserved that." Warren walked away. Ethan stood in the corridor for a moment, not moving, with the feeling of something settling that had been suspended for a long time. Helen Park's piece ran in October, and it was not the article Ethan had expected. He'd anticipated the narrative he'd heard the outline of when she first called. The story of the Bugatti, the investor event, the impossible problem solved. Those elements were there, but they weren't the center. The center of the piece was Raymond Cole. She had found people Ethan hadn't known she'd looked for. Former customers of the Roanoke shop, people who'd brought Raymond Cole their impossible problems over the decades and watched him sit with them and solve them. She'd found a retired engineer from a manufacturing plant who remembered Raymond diagnosing a production line fault in 1994 that a team of his own engineers had missed for 3 months, and who had asked Raymond afterward how he'd found it, and remembered Raymond's answer. "I stopped looking for what broke and started listening to what was fighting." She'd found Raymond Cole's high school shop teacher, who was 91 years old and in a nursing facility outside Roanoke, who had said, with the clarity of very old people who remember specific things with unexpected precision, "Ray had a mind that didn't do what you expected. He'd take a problem and turn it into a question about something else. That's not common. I've been teaching for 40 years, and I've only seen 2 or 3 people who did that." She'd found a photograph, somehow, of Raymond's shop. The actual Roanoke shop, exterior shot, probably from the early 90s based on the cars visible in the lot. The building was modest, the signage was simple. The photograph was so ordinary that it was almost startling. The ordinariness of where something significant had lived, invisible to everyone who drove past. The piece ran under the title, "What Got Lost and What Didn't." Ethan read it at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning, before Lily woke up. He read it slowly, the way his father had read things, and he didn't put it down until he'd finished it. Then he sat there for a while. Lily came downstairs at 7:30 in her pajamas, the ones with small rocket ships on them that she was technically too old for and wore anyway. She saw his face and stopped at the bottom of the stairs. "What happened?" "Nothing bad," he said quickly. "Come read something." She climbed onto the chair beside him, and he moved the laptop so she could see. She read slowly, with the particular focused attention she brought to things she decided were worth her full effort. She was a fast reader, but she read this carefully, and he watched her face while she read, the small movements in it as she processed what she was encountering. She got to the part about the high school shop teacher. She read it twice. Then she looked at Ethan. He remembered Grandpa. Yes, from when Grandpa was young. Grandpa was 16 when he was in that teacher's class. She looked back at the screen. She read the quote again, the one about turning a problem into a question about something else. That's what you do, she said. Not accusing, not amazed, just observing, filing it into the category where she kept things she'd noticed and confirmed. I learned it from him. She sat with that for a moment. Then, with the sideways approach to significant things that was becoming more characteristic of her as she got older. Do you think he knew that it would keep going after him? Ethan thought about the 7 notebooks, about the first page of the first one, the principle written at the top in Raymond's careful hand, about the way his father had written down things that weren't for customers or colleagues or anyone specific, that were written the way a person writes when they're trying to make something survive their own forgetting. I think he hoped it would, he said. I don't think he knew. Lily nodded. She seemed to find this acceptable. She reached over and closed the laptop gently, as if closing something that had been said and was now complete. And then she said, "Can we have eggs?" "Yeah," he said. "We can have eggs." He made eggs. Lily sat at the counter and told him about a book she was reading, some middle-grade novel about a girl who discovered her apartment building was hiding a secret ecosystem in the basement, and she described it with the animated precision of someone recounting events that were real to her, which was the way she'd always engaged with stories that captured her. He listened and cooked, and the kitchen smelled like butter and coffee, and the Sunday morning outside was gray and cool, the kind of October day that smells like wood smoke, and the particular quality of air that means the year is turning. The article circulated in the industry in a way that Helen Park had anticipated and Ethan had not. The automotive press picked it up. Then a broader technology publication ran a short piece referencing it. Then 2 university engineering programs reached out to Claire Navarro about potential curriculum partnerships. The methodology, it turned out, had resonance beyond the automotive context, the system's conflict framework applicable to any sufficiently complex mechanical or electronic system. Claire handled the inquiries with her characteristic organized efficiency and called Ethan to report them with the barely contained energy of someone who was restraining the urge to use the word exploding. 2 universities, she said. I heard you. One of them wants to discuss incorporating the framework into their graduate diagnostics curriculum. That's good. Ethan, graduate curriculum. Claire, I'm just saying. I know what you're saying. Handle it. Talk to Warren. He'll know how to structure those conversations properly. A pause. You're remarkably calm about this. I'm standing in a parking lot in Millhaven, he said. It's cold and I forgot my jacket. I'm being appropriately calm. He could hear her trying not to laugh. Fine. I'll loop in Warren, but at some point you're going to have to process that this is real. I'll process it Thursday. I have a differential to rebuild tomorrow. She did laugh then, finally. Go rebuild your differential. The conversation with Aurora that mattered most happened in November, 5 weeks after the article ran. Not over the phone, in person, in her office, on one of his regular visits, the kind of visit that had by now settled into a rhythm that felt less like consulting and more like a position he occupied without a title that perfectly described it. She'd been more tired lately. He'd noticed it in the last 2 visits. Not visibly tired, not the sleep deprivation look of April that had made her appear to be holding herself together through force of will. Something else. The tired of someone who had been running hard for a long time and was beginning to notice it. The board wants to formalize your role, she said, without preamble. They were at the desk in her lived-in office, the whiteboard still covered in old writing, the coffee maker doing its faithful work. Not the consulting arrangement, something with a proper title and a proper seat. What title? They're debating between Chief Diagnostic Officer and Director of Methodological Innovation. She said the second one with a slight flatness that suggested she found it as unwieldy as it sounded. Neither is quite right. No. What would you call it? He thought about it. Head of Diagnostic Development. It says what it is without sounding like it was designed by a committee. She wrote it down. That's what it'll be. She looked at him. Millhaven doesn't change. Your shop doesn't change. We've built the arrangement around your life, and it stays built that way. I know. I want to be clear about it, because the title changes the formality, and I don't want the formality to change the reality. Aurora. She stopped. I know, he said again. Meaning, I trust you on this. You don't need to keep building the case. She held his look for a moment, and something in her expression did what it sometimes did, moved past the executive layer into the actual person, who was 30 years old and had been carrying more than she should since she was 24, and who had learned not to show most of it. The article, she said, what Helen wrote about your father. Yeah. Did it land the way you wanted? He considered the question. It landed more than I wanted in some ways, less in others. He looked at the window. The Los Angeles November was doing what it always did, which was look almost exactly like October. The seasonal change here being subtle enough that someone from Virginia could miss it if they weren't paying attention. I wanted his methodology to be taken seriously. That's happened. I wanted his name on it. That's happened. He paused. What I couldn't make happen was him knowing about it. That's the part that doesn't fit anywhere. Aurora was quiet. She was good at quiet. She didn't fill it with sympathy sounds or redirect to something more manageable. She just let it be what it was. He would have argued with the article, Ethan said after a moment. He would have said Helen got the technical explanation slightly wrong in paragraph 6, which she did. He would have been suspicious of the attention. He would have called me and said, I don't know why people are making such a fuss, in a way that made it obvious he was actually pleased. He stopped. He would have asked about Lily. He always asked about Lily first. What would you have told him? That she's remarkable and difficult, and that she told me last week the ecosystem novel was scientifically imprecise but emotionally accurate, which is a sentence an 8-year-old shouldn't be able to construct, but somehow she did. He looked at Aurora, and he would have laughed and said she got that from him. Aurora smiled, the real kind. Did she? Probably. Darius Webb solved his first significant unassisted problem in November, in the 9th week of the program. A vehicle had been brought in with an issue that 3 of Sterling's senior technicians had spent a week on, intermittent power loss under specific load conditions, disappearing on the diagnostic rig, the classic signature of a cross-system conflict. Ethan had flagged it as a teaching case, but hadn't brought it to the cohort yet. Darius found it on his own. He'd been working late. He had a habit of staying after the formal sessions ended, which Ethan had noted and not discouraged. And he'd apparently spent 2 evenings mapping the vehicle's systems using the interaction framework, drawing his maps by hand on paper in the way the notebook suggested, before running any equipment-based tests. He came to Ethan on a Wednesday morning with a piece of paper covered in his careful handwriting and a conclusion. He was right. Not approximately right, but precisely right. He'd identified the conflict between the load management module and the fuel injection timing system, mapped the specific window in which their interaction created the power loss, and proposed the correct sequence of adjustments. He'd done it with fewer resources and less experience than any of the senior technicians who'd spent a week failing to find it. Ethan stood in the bay looking at Darius's paper for a long moment. Walk me through your process, he said. From the beginning. Darius walked him through it. He'd used the framework correctly, mapped the relationships first, asked what each system's behavior suggested about adjacent systems, identified the anomaly in the overlap that each system individually considered noise. He'd done it the way the notebooks described it. He'd also done one thing the notebooks didn't describe, one step that was his own, a way of categorizing the conflict signature that was a genuine addition to the methodology, a shortcut in the mapping process that preserved the rigor while reducing the time required. Ethan listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When Darius finished, there was a silence. The categorization step you added, Ethan said, between the relationship map and the overlap identification. That's not in the document. I know, it felt like a missing step. The map was giving me too much information at once, and I needed a way to filter it before I looked at the overlaps. Write it down, Ethan said, exactly the way you just described it to me. Then we're going to add it to the document. Darius stared at him. Add it? The methodology isn't finished, Ethan said. My father kept adding to it for 38 years. That's not a bug, that's the design. The design is that it keeps growing as more people think about it. He folded the paper and handed it back. "Write down the step. Put your name on it." The look on Darius Webb's face was something Ethan knew he would carry with him for a long time. Not the elation of recognition, but the deeper, stranger feeling of a person who has realized that the knowledge they carry has a future, that it's going somewhere, that they are not a dead end. He recognized it because he'd felt it himself, in a garage in Hawthorne in April, standing next to a Bugatti that had just roared back to life. The evening of the day he told Darius to write the step down, Ethan drove home from the regional airport in the dark, windows down despite the November cold. He pulled into his driveway and sat in the truck for a minute before going inside, the way he sometimes did, not avoiding the house, just taking a breath before the shift from one kind of life to the other. The porch light was on. He'd installed a timer for it years ago, so it would be on when he got home late, because coming home to a dark house was the kind of small thing that accumulated over time into something that mattered. Lily had been campaigning for a dog for 8 months, with an intensity that suggested this was not a passing interest, and he'd begun to think seriously about conceding. Sandra's dog had apparently been a formative influence. He thought about Diana Reeves, who he'd had coffee with twice since the Corvette, in the deliberate and slightly awkward way of people who are trying to find out whether something is there without either one of them declaring that they're looking. It was early and fragile, and he didn't know what it was yet, which was uncomfortable, and also, he'd decided, probably right. Some things needed to be approached slowly. He thought about his father's shop in Roanoke, and the 91-year-old teacher who still remembered a 16-year-old who turned problems into questions about something else. He thought about 38 years of work that had almost disappeared, and about 12 people in a garage in Hawthorne who were carrying it forward, one of whom had already added to it in a way his father never had. He thought about the fact that knowledge is not a fixed thing. It's not a monument. It's a living system, and living systems either grow or they don't, and if they don't, they eventually go quiet. His father's thinking had almost gone quiet. It hadn't. And the reason it hadn't was not one person or one moment. It was a series of connections that had no business existing. A retired aerospace engineer with a Mustang, a phone call from Los Angeles, a legal pad covered in circles and arrows, a car that started. He got out of the truck. The night air had the particular cold, clean smell of Virginia in November, and somewhere down the block a neighbor had left their outdoor lights on, orange in the dark. He went inside. Lily was asleep, predictably. She'd left a note on the kitchen table in her handwriting, which was becoming more her own and less like the generic practice sheet handwriting of early elementary school. She was developing a slight leftward slant that she'd come to on her own, because she held her pencil differently than she'd been taught and had refused to change it. The note said, "Eggs in fridge. Sandra called. Dog question still open." He smiled at the note. He put it in the kitchen drawer where he put things he wanted to keep. He poured a glass of water and stood at the kitchen counter and thought about tomorrow. The shop, Jake and his still improving differential work, the call with Claire about the university partnership that he'd been putting off, a brake job on a minivan whose owner had been waiting patiently in the way that certain people wait, with a courtesy that made you want to not let them down. Ordinary things. The kind that make up a life from the inside, the texture that the outside of a life doesn't show. He'd come to believe, more than he'd believed it before any of this started, that the ordinary things were not the cost of the important things. They were the ground the important things grew in. You couldn't have one without the other. His father had known this, had lived it, in Roanoke, in 38 years of showing up for ordinary work, with an extraordinary mind that never asked for an extraordinary stage. He picked up the notebook from the counter, the 7th one, the last one Raymond had filled. He didn't open it. He just held it for a second the way you hold something that matters, feeling the weight of it, which was not heavy. Then he put it down and went to check on his daughter. She was in her configuration, half off the pillow, one arm over the side, and the nightlight made the room the soft amber of small children's rooms everywhere, a color that meant safety in some language older than words. He stood in the doorway the way he always did, long enough to be sure of her, then went back down the hall. The house settled around him in its night sounds, the refrigerator, the heat coming on, the street outside quiet in the way that streets in small towns go quiet, thoroughly, like they mean it. Raymond Cole's methodology was in 11 countries now, according to the last count Claire had given him, carried in the thinking of people who had encountered it through various channels: the article, the document, the formal validation, the word of mouth that spread through the industry in the particular way that genuinely useful things spread, which is not loudly but persistently the way water finds its level. His name was on it. On the document, in the program literature, in Helen Park's article, in the preliminary review that Warren's contact had described as a genuine contribution. Raymond Cole, one-man shop, Roanoke, Virginia, 38 years. Ethan sat at the kitchen table one more time, not to work, just to sit. He looked at the chair across from him, which was Lily's chair, and thought about the morning she'd read the article and asked whether his father had known the thinking would keep going. He hadn't said everything he'd thought in that moment, because some things you hold until you know how to say them or until the right person asks. What he'd thought was this: Raymond had written the notebooks not because he was sure they would matter, but because the alternative, letting the thinking die with him, was something he couldn't do. It wasn't optimism, it wasn't certainty. It was the same stubbornness that had made him turn every problem into a question about something else. The refusal to accept that the answer didn't exist just because he hadn't found it yet. The thinking had survived because Raymond couldn't stand the idea of it not surviving. And then it had found people. A son, a company, a journalist, a kid in Memphis who held his pencil the right way when writing something that mattered. And it had become something more than one man's private understanding. It had become a conversation, the kind that keeps going after everyone who started it is gone. Ethan turned off the kitchen light. He went to bed in a house that was quiet and his and full of the things that mattered. His daughter sleeping down the hall, a notebook on the kitchen counter, a shop that would need opening in the morning, a world that was slightly different than it had been in April, in ways that mostly couldn't be seen from the outside. He slept. Outside Millhaven was its usual self, 11,000 people in the dark, ordinary and sufficient, and exactly what a place needs to be. The Bugatti sat in its garage in Hawthorne, 3,000 miles away, engine cold, every system quiet and cooperative and in complete agreement with itself. No conflict, no argument, just a machine at rest, waiting for the next time someone would ask it to run. It would run.